What if the first wound of our species did not happen on Earth, but in the memory of a world we were never meant to remember? Some traces feel like echoes, fragments of tablets weathered by time, star maps drawn by hands that trembled before a sky now lost to us. And beneath those fading symbols lies a silence, the kind that suggests something was abandoned long before our histories began. Perhaps a home, perhaps a truth, or perhaps a sorrow too vast to name. If you choose to stay awake with me, we can follow that faint trail together into the shadows where Nibiru once breathed. There is a point in every ancient narrative where the silence becomes louder than the surviving words, and with Nibiru that silence begins long before any myth calls its name. The Sumerian tablets speak often of gods arriving from somewhere, yet they rarely linger on what was left behind. That absence leaves a fracture, one that feels deliberate, as if the past itself tried to erase a piece too heavy for later minds to hold. The question rising from that fracture isn't simply where the Anunnaki came from, but why any civilization would abandon the cradle that shaped it. For if their home was truly a wandering world, then what force could sever a species from its birthplace? The thought drifts through the lives of people who once looked upward, with a fear we have forgotten. The Assyriologist Samuel Noah Kramer once wrote about how the earliest Sumerian hymns describe exiles of the sky, figures bearing knowledge that appeared already sharpened. Scholars have long argued over whether that phrase reflects a poetic metaphor or a cultural memory. Yet even the most cautious admit that such language hints at a rupture predating written history. And when the rupture is older than language, one must look not to words but to patterns. Among those patterns lies the strange obsession ancient cultures shared with stars that move differently. The Babylonians tracked long-period celestial objects with an unease that modern astronomy later understood. Bodies with eccentric orbits behave unpredictably, as if their loyalty to the sun is conditional. If the Anunnaki myth holds any faint memory of a real world, then Nibiru may not have been stable, may not have been safe. Geological studies show that planets, or even large moons, undergo catastrophic changes when orbital paths shift even slightly. A tilt, a resonance, a passing gravitational encounter can tear an atmosphere apart or freeze oceans into monuments of extinction. Could such a shift be the first shadow behind the Anunnaki's departure? But instability alone cannot explain the feeling embedded in the oldest stories. The feeling of loss, not escape. A home destroyed is tragedy. A home left behind is regret. What kind of transformation forces a people to leave, yet still binds them with longing so strong it becomes myth? In the late 19th century, researchers examining Akkadian laments noted a recurring motif: cities described as orphaned, temples abandoned by their lords. While most scholars treat these as reflections of political collapse, some thinkers, like Zecharia Sitchin, controversially suggested they might encode memories of something deeper, a cosmic departure mirrored in earthly rites. His theories are debated, often dismissed, yet the emotional truth embedded in those ancient laments feels older than any single city. They mourned something larger than stone, and then there is the geological riddle buried beneath our own oceans, layers of iridium-rich sediment and sudden climate anomalies that mark periods when Earth encountered unusual cosmic debris. These events do not prove Nibiru, but they do prove that civilizations have lived under skies capable of dramatic disruptive visitors. If a world like Nibiru ever crossed near Earth, even briefly, it could have left imprints in myth, fear, and ritual. Echoes at the edges of civilization struggling to interpret celestial events with pre-scientific eyes. Perhaps the Anunnaki were not gods, but survivors of a world shaped by cycles of cosmic danger, forced to migrate as their orbit decayed, or their environment changed beyond endurance. Yet another strand complicates the story: the ancient fascination with metals. Sumerian temple archives record extraordinary value placed on gold, an element that reflects infrared radiation so effectively that modern science uses it in spacecraft shielding. This connection has long fueled speculation that the Anunnaki sought resources to preserve a failing atmosphere. While the evidence for such a project remains speculative, it does raise a haunting possibility. What if the departure from Nibiru was not a migration of choice, but a race against a slow, planetary suffocation? And if so, How long does a civilization mourn the world that held its first breath? What drifts through the remnants of these narratives is not certainty but longing, an emotional residue embedded in myths scattered across continents. The Maya spoke of cycles of worlds destroyed and reborn. The Greeks whispered of lands swallowed by shifts in the heavens. Indigenous Australian stories describe skies that changed their paths in ages long before memory. These accounts diverge wildly, yet they share a single anxiety: the fear that the sky itself can betray us. And fear, more than anything, shapes the way civilizations remember loss. Perhaps the Anunnaki did not simply abandon Nibiru. Perhaps they carried with them the trauma of watching a familiar sky turn hostile, a home fall out of harmony with its star. If their world slipped into an orbit that condemned it to extremes of heat and cold, then every return to the inner solar system might have deepened the wound, reminding them of what was lost, yet offering no path back to stability. What kind of history grows from a wound that never closes? What kind of myths form when a civilization cannot return home, even if it remembers every detail of what home once was? And so the question lingers, trembling beneath every ancient text that hints at origins without describing their source. Were the Anunnaki telling stories of divine descent? Or were they whispering memories of exile? And if what they abandoned was not merely a planet, but an entire way of being, what traces of that departure still hide within the stories humanity inherited without realizing? There is a particular strangeness in how the oldest civilizations spoke of beginnings, not as cheerful myths of creation, but as fragments recovered from something already broken. When the Sumerians described their gods descending, they never celebrated the place they came from. They emphasized arrival, not origin. It is as if the memory of Nibiru was spoken only through the shadows it cast, not through the world itself. And in that absence, a new contradiction emerges. If the Anunnaki left their home willingly, why does every trace of their lore feel weighed by sorrow rather than triumph? Some scholars argue that the earliest cuneiform scriptures contain hints of a forgotten catastrophe, buried beneath layers of religious reinterpretation. The scholar Thorkild Jacobsen once noted that Sumerian cosmology contains unusual references to the time before the measurement of days, a phrase so obscure that it resists translation. For a culture obsessed with calendars, tracking celestial movements with unmatched precision, the idea of a pre-time, a period when the sky could not be measured, suggests astronomical instability. And in astronomical instability, civilizations lose their sense of permanence. Could this memory reflect not Earth's sky, but the sky of a different world, one whose seasons were unpredictable, whose orbit was drifting? If Nibiru's orbit was long, elliptical, or erratic, then the inhabitants would have lived under a changing firmament. Temperature extremes might have fractured ecosystems. Cycles of abundance and scarcity could have shaped their social and technological development. Modern research on exoplanets shows that eccentric worlds often experience violent environmental oscillations. Oceans boiling and freezing within the same long year, atmospheres thinning under repeated gravitational stresses. For a species born into such instability, survival would depend on adaptation, engineering, and perhaps eventually, escape. But what if escape was not motivated solely by survival? What if it was also fueled by something discovered, something that altered the trajectory of their civilization? The oldest Mesopotamian myths describe the Anunnaki as those who observe, a phrase that resonates oddly with traditions across the world. The Dogon people of Mali, for instance, preserve ancient knowledge of the Sirius star system that aligns uncannily with modern astronomy. Polynesian navigators spoke of teachers from the sky, who knew oceanic patterns invisible to the naked eye. These accounts, though culturally unique, share a peculiar shape, an advanced knowledge appearing suddenly without developmental roots. It raises a provocative question. Did certain ancient peoples preserve distant memories passed down from a source older than their own lineage? Yet even these echoes do not reveal why a civilization would leave its birthplace behind. For that, one must look at the emotional undertones encoded in myths. Consider the Sumerian tale of Enki and Ninhursag, less a myth of power, more a lament for a land bereft of its former abundance. Or the Eridu Genesis, which describes a world darkened at its edges, a poetic image easily dismissed as allegory, unless it reflects something literal. A planet's atmosphere thinning would darken the horizon first, leaving the sky dim, the air cold, the world increasingly fragile. Something in these texts suggests not a sudden disaster, but a long decline, one that generations would have experienced as fate slowly tightening. This slow unravelling poses another question. If Nibiru was failing, who decided it was time to leave? Migration on a planetary scale requires immense coordination, yet myths portray the Anunnaki as divided, often contentious. The Enuma Elish describes conflicts among celestial beings, interpreted by some as metaphors for political rifts. Others see them as memories of factions debating survival strategies. Even in controversy, a deeper truth persists. Civilizations do not move as one. Some cling to home, some push toward the unknown. Could the abandonment of Nibiru have splintered their society, leaving wounds that carried into the stories they later shared with humanity? There is another layer, one tied not to astronomy or myth, but to something hidden in the Earth itself. In 2013, an unusual discovery beneath the Antarctic ice revealed traces of ancient microorganisms that had survived in isolation for millions of years. Though unrelated to Nibiru, the finding reignited debates about panspermia, the idea that life can migrate across worlds. If Earth was capable of sustaining ancient seeds waiting for favourable conditions, then cosmic migration becomes less implausible. The Anunnaki, if they existed as a spacefaring civilization, might not have simply arrived. They may have carried with them biological, cultural, or technological remnants of a world slowly dying behind them. But perhaps the most unsettling question is this. What if not all of them made the journey? Myths of fallen or banished beings appear across continents, titans imprisoned beneath the earth, watchers cast down from the heavens, deities described as bound to the deep. Could these stories reflect memories of those who resisted the Exodus, or those unable to leave a collapsing homeworld? A planet undergoing environmental collapse would not offer comfort for long, yet the emotional weight of abandoning one's cradle might fracture a people, driving some toward desperate attempts to hold on, others toward reluctant departure. And then there is the matter of memory itself. Civilizations do not always narrate their past truthfully. Trauma reshapes stories. Shame distorts events. Loss introduces gaps. If the Anunnaki truly left Nibiru, the story of their departure may have been retold through myth, because the factual truth was unbearable. What is easier to say? We fled a dying world, or we descended from the heavens as gods? Myths often mask pain with grandeur. They replace grief with symbolism. They veil vulnerability with divine authority. Yet even behind these masks, something of the old sorrow remains. It lingers in the broken lines of tablets, in hymns that sound more like apologies than triumphs, in the silence surrounding the name of a world that supposedly birthed them. And so the mystery deepens. If the Anunnaki carried with them the memory of a home crumbling under a hostile cosmos, how much of that memory did they pass to humanity? And how much did they bury, hoping never to confront it again? The traces left behind by the Anunnaki, if indeed they once walked among early humans, carry a texture that feels less like the legacy of conquerors and more like the residue of refugees. And when refugees build new homes, they often do so with symbols pointing back toward what they lost. Across the ancient world, certain motifs appear inexplicably synchronized. The winged disk, the ascending stairway of 7 levels, the figure straddling 2 realms, earth and sky. Conventional archaeology views these as mere artistic parallels, yet their uncanny recurrence suggests something older, something shared, something remembered. And when one asks why such symbols persist, a new and delicate question stirs. Were these images memorials to a world no longer safe to return to? In the ruins of Nineveh, tablets recount a cosmology where divine beings debate the fate of creation. One fragment speaks of the distant place where the horizon bleeds, a line dismissed by some scholars as poetic flourish. But others note its strangeness. The horizon, in a stable world, never bleeds. A planet undergoing atmospheric or magnetic instability, however, might show terrifying skies, ion storms, auroras that crackled like serpents, sunsets warped by dust. A world in decline does not fade quietly. It announces its suffering in light and shadow. If Nibiru endured such changes, its people would have carved those memories into their symbols, not as warnings to others, but as a way to remember themselves. This concept reshapes the Anunnaki narrative. Rather than powerful deities descending to rule, they become survivors carrying fragments of a shattered sky, embedding them into art and architecture so the memory of their origin would not dissolve into the chaos of a new beginning. Yet even in these symbols, something remains unsaid. It is the same silence that lies between broken myths in every ancient culture. A silence that suggests knowledge withheld, or perhaps knowledge too painful to articulate. Consider the peculiar case of the Zagros Mountains obsidian trade. Archaeologists have long puzzled over how early Sumerian settlements acquired volcanic glass from sources hundreds of miles away, long before the formation of extensive trade networks. Some researchers propose that these routes hint at a sophisticated system of movement inherited rather than invented, skills brought by a people accustomed to long, perilous migrations. If the Anunnaki possessed a tradition of travel born from an unstable homeworld, then the patterns of early human movement might bear faint echoes of their journeys. Migration, after all, can be taught through behaviour as much as language. And then there is the troubling matter of the Watchers, described in fragments of the Book of Giants found among the Dead Sea Scrolls. They are portrayed not as divine overseers, but as beings trapped between worlds, neither fully belonging to earth nor sky. Many scholars link these figures to Mesopotamian predecessors, arguing that myth travelled through cultures like a drifting seed. But if one reads them as memories rather than metaphors, a different image forms, the image of a people torn between remaining with their dying world and adapting to a foreign one. The Watchers are the ones who never fully left Nibiru behind, emotionally or culturally. They gaze upward not with curiosity, but with longing. Longing. That is the thread binding all these myths. Civilizations rarely invent stories of loss unless they are struggling to understand something inherited, something unresolved. The Maya described previous worlds destroyed in cycles of fire and ice. The Zoroastrian Bundahejan spoke of a star that returns bringing judgment. Chinese chronicles told of years when the heavens shifted their order. Each tradition is unique, yet all hint at disruption, displacement, and the terror of skies that no longer behaved as expected. Could these be cultural memories of real cosmic disturbances, interpreted differently in each region? Could they reflect stories passed from an earlier civilization whose own world was shaped by celestial instability? If so, then Nibiru's abandonment may not have been a singular event, but the culmination of generations watching their environment erode. A planet with a decaying orbit would swing closer to its star during certain cycles, scorching landscapes, then drift into cold, lethal darkness at others. Over centuries, such extremes could break ecosystems beyond repair. Agriculture would collapse, oceans might retreat or crystallize, cities would crumble as stone fractured under relentless thermal expansion. A civilization enduring such trauma would not simply leave, it would mourn. This mourning might explain why the Anunnaki, in Sumerian lore, appear obsessed with preserving knowledge. Astronomy, irrigation, metallurgy. These are not the interests of conquerors seeking power. They are the priorities of a people desperate to ensure survival, determined not to repeat the mistakes that doomed their home. A dying world teaches harsh lessons, and those who escape carry those lessons like scars. Yet there remains a deeper, quieter question beneath all of this. Did the Anunnaki foresee their world's collapse but fail to prevent it? If so, the shame of that failure might haunt every myth in which they appear as infallible. Civilizations often rewrite their past to soften the edges of regret. The Anunnaki portrayed as gods may be a way of masking the truth that even advanced beings can be powerless against a universe governed by forces indifferent to suffering. The most unsettling thought arises from this possibility. What if the Anunnaki left not because Nibiru was dying, but because they could not bear to watch it die? Departure, in that case, becomes an act of grief rather than strategy. And grief leaves traces, symbolic, emotional, cultural. Those traces ripple across human history in stories of heavenly beings who no longer dwell where they once belonged. But if the Anunnaki carried such sorrow into the world they later touched, what echoes of that sorrow still lie buried in the civilizations they influenced? And if humanity inherited even a fraction of that ancient ache, how much of what we call myth is simply an attempt to remember something we never truly experienced? Certain questions linger not because they cannot be answered, but because the very attempt to answer them brushes against something ancient and wounded. And the deeper one travels into the echoes surrounding Nibiru, the more a strange tension emerges between what was remembered and what was deliberately allowed to fade. Myths across Mesopotamia speak of the Anunnaki as if they carried a weight older than any earthly dynasty, a heaviness that shaped even the way they interacted with early humans. If they truly arrived as survivors, then every cultural seed they planted may have been shaped not by ambition, but by the spectral memory of a world already slipping away. And perhaps that is why so many of their teachings begin with warnings rather than victories. Archaeologists working in the ruins of Eridu, the city some call the first in history, often remark upon its peculiar duality. It was both sacred and practical, a place where spiritual rituals blended seamlessly with engineering expertise. The ancient canals, precisely angled to harness seasonal floods, reveal a mastery of water management far beyond what should have been possible for a fledgling civilization. Some scholars attribute this sophistication to millennia of trial and error, yet others sense something anomalous, a sudden leap in knowledge without a visible developmental path. Such leaps appear across the early human timeline, abrupt and unanchored. Could they reflect fragments of a much older tradition transplanted from elsewhere? If Nibiru's inhabitants endured climatic or orbital chaos, they would have learned to manipulate environments, conserve resources, and stabilize ecosystems in ways that Earth's early cultures could only marvel at. Knowledge born from desperation often becomes generational instinct. Survival imprints itself onto every innovation. Perhaps what appeared as gifts from the gods were simply techniques the Anunnaki clung to, methods that had once kept them alive during cycles of planetary upheaval. And yet, woven into the earliest hymns, there is an unmistakable longing, as if even the most advanced engineering could not shield them from the grief of losing a familiar sky. This grief can be felt in unexpected places. In 1922, archaeologists studying the royal cemetery of noticed something odd, a recurring depiction of a boat navigating a star-filled void. Traditional interpretations frame these as funerary metaphors, guiding souls to the afterlife. But a minority of researchers argue these scenes contain technical details inconsistent with pure symbolism, patterns resembling celestial navigation maps, repeated angles suggestive of orbital trajectories. These interpretations remain controversial, yet they evoke a haunting possibility. What if the imagery preserved a cultural memory of migration through the darkness between worlds? What if the boats of the dead were echoes of journeys taken not across seas, but across a cosmic night? Even if such interpretations stretch the imagination, they point toward an emotional truth embedded in the mythic substrate, a civilization wrestling with the trauma of movement. Every culture touched by the Anunnaki legacy, Sumerian, Akkadian, Babylonian, carries faint hints of something left behind, something no longer reachable. The lament, "The place of our beginning is sealed," appears in different forms across multiple tablets, often attributed to natural disasters or divine withdrawal. But the repetition of this sentiment, the sense of a door closed forever, suggests a deeper ache, one not tied to any specific earthly event. Across continents, similar feelings echo. The Hopi people of North America speak of the earlier worlds destroyed by imbalance, their ancestors guided to survival by beings who descended when the sky was out of order. In ancient Egypt, the followers of Horus were described as inheritors of a land that no longer existed, their knowledge carried like a burden. These parallels do not prove contact with an extraterrestrial civilization, but they do hint at a shared psychological residue, an ancient fear that worlds can end, and that knowledge must be carried forward before everything collapses. If the Anunnaki carried the memory of a dying home, then interacting with humanity may have been less about dominion and more about preservation, preserving knowledge, preserving meaning, preserving a piece of themselves. Yet myths rarely portray them as unified. Texts depict rivalries, quarrels, splintered councils. A civilization facing extinction would inevitably fracture along ideological lines. Some would argue for departure, others for restoration, still others for denial. Trauma divides even the strongest societies, and those divisions leave scars visible in their stories. One more disturbing possibility emerges when examining these internal tensions. What if the Anunnaki's departure was not unanimous? Sumerian texts speak of beings who remained in the sealed place, associated with darkness, silence, and sorrow. Their identities blur in translation. Some interpret them as underworld deities, others as symbolic representations of natural forces. But the phrasing is curious. To remain implies a choice. To be sealed suggests irreversible isolation. Did some of their kind refuse to leave Nibiru, believing restoration still possible? Or were they physically unable to depart, victims of circumstance while others escaped? This possibility casts the myths of fallen or banished beings in a new, softer light. Not rebels, not monsters, but remnants, survivors of abandonment rather than perpetrators of defiance. Across traditions, these figures seem haunted, trapped, burdened by memories too heavy to carry. And humanity, listening to fragments of their stories, may have inherited the emotional residue without understanding its origin. Earth itself bears scars that mirror these themes. Geological records reveal numerous near-extinction events, volcanic winters, asteroid impacts, abrupt climate shifts. Each left imprints in human mythology long after the events faded from scientific memory. If early humans already possessed an echo of extraterrestrial sorrow, however faint, it might have mingled with earthly catastrophes, forming myths of divine beings mourning losses beyond human comprehension. The grief of one world layered upon the grief of another, and beneath all these swirling possibilities lies a final quiet question. If the Anunnaki truly abandoned a world unravelling under cosmic forces, what lessons did they hope humanity would learn? Were they warning us that every civilization, no matter how advanced, is vulnerable to the slow turning of celestial wheels? Or were they trying, in their own fractured way, to ensure that no world, Earth or otherwise, would face its ending alone? If so, then how many of their warnings still lie hidden within myths we recite without understanding, waiting for a moment when we finally ask, what exactly was lost when Nibiru was left behind? And why do we still feel the echo of that loss thousands of years later? There are moments in the study of ancient civilizations when the evidence feels less like data and more like a gentle tremor beneath the surface of the known world. The narrative surrounding Nibiru becomes such a tremor. Subtle, persistent, refusing to disappear even when scholars attempt to smooth it into myth. And the more one listens to these tremors, the more a subtle fear emerges. Fear that the Anunnaki's departure from their home was not a singular event, but part of a larger cycle, a cosmic pattern repeating itself across worlds and epochs. If so, their story becomes less a legend and more a caution whispered across millennia. One of the most intriguing clues lies in ancient astronomical records that do not fit neatly into the established sky of antiquity. Babylonian star catalogues such as the Emul-Apin contain references to stranger stars that appear and vanish over long intervals. Most are interpreted today as comets, novae, or misidentified planets, but certain entries describe movement inconsistent with known celestial objects. Motions too slow for comets, too erratic for planets, too persistent for optical illusions. These anomalies do not prove Nibiru existed, yet they raise a quiet question. What if ancient astronomers inherited fragmented knowledge of a celestial body that once shaped their ancestors' fears? When civilizations lack context, they mythologize. To them, a slow-moving celestial intruder would be a divine messenger, a warning, or an omen of upheaval. The Anunnaki, if they carried memories of such events from their own world, might have used these moments to teach early humans how to read the sky, not as a space of wonder, but as a clock counting down toward possible catastrophe. The earliest ziggurats, aligned with celestial pathways, may not have been solely temples, but cosmic observatories built with an urgency modern eyes struggle to perceive. Perhaps the alignment was not meant to honor gods, but to track cycles. Cycles once tied to a homeworld that no longer welcomed life. This urgency surfaces in stories that, at first glance, seem purely metaphorical. In the Atrahasis epic, for example, the gods complain of noise generated by growing human populations. But beneath the mythic language, archaeologists like Stephanie Daly, have noted structural parallels to ecological collapse, resource scarcity, environmental strain, population thresholds. Such issues would have haunted a world undergoing orbital instability, where periodic extremes could devastate cities or agricultural zones. If the Anunnaki lived through such cycles, their warnings about balance, restraint and harmony may have been shaped by bitter experience. What humans later framed as divine law might once have been survival strategies on a volatile planet. Yet another faint thread appears in the realm of acoustics and sacred architecture. Temples in Eridu, Ur, and later Babylon were constructed with resonant chambers capable of amplifying low-frequency sounds. Modern researchers studying archaeoacoustics note that these frequencies can induce altered states of consciousness, reducing anxiety and enhancing focus. Why would such features matter to early builders? One possible answer lies in planetary trauma. If the Anunnaki originated from a world where natural phenomena, quakes, ion storms, atmospheric vibrations, generated unsettling sounds, their descendants may have developed rituals to soothe collective nerves, rituals later translated into architecture. In this sense, the temples of ancient Mesopotamia might not memorialize gods, but memories of a world that hummed with unstable resonance. The idea becomes more haunting when one considers how certain myths describe the Anunnaki's voices, carrying the echoes of the deep. Such descriptions lose their metaphorical simplicity when viewed against the backdrop of a planet in decline, one whose atmosphere might have carried unusual frequencies before its final collapse. Trauma imprinted through sound can linger for generations. Perhaps the low tones woven through their chants, hymns, and rituals were not symbolic at all, but simply familiar, reminders of the environment that shaped them. But even these possibilities do not fully explain the most troubling paradox surrounding Nibiru, the deliberate vagueness of its fate. Sumerian texts contain startling detail about mundane matters, grain measurements, livestock counts, trade routes, yet remain frustratingly elusive when describing the cosmic homeland of their gods. This inconsistency invites speculation. When a culture preserves trivial details but obscures foundational ones, something has been selectively forgotten, or perhaps selectively concealed. One theory proposed by scholar Giorgio de Santillana examines the global consistency of myths describing a world before the current order, preserved through veiled narratives of floods, fires, or cosmic upheaval. He argued that these stories encode esoteric astronomical knowledge often dismissed as allegory because it no longer aligns with observable reality. But what if some of this knowledge originally referred not to Earth, but to a different planet altogether? A planet whose cycles, seasons, and disasters became encoded in symbolic form long after the physical world had been abandoned? If the Anunnaki did indeed shield certain truths about their exodus, about their home's collapse, it may have been to prevent Earth's early inhabitants from inheriting their fears. What use is the knowledge of a dying world to a new civilization trying to find its footing? Yet suppression breeds distortion. Over centuries, half-remembered warnings become myths of wrathful gods, tales of judgment, prophecies of return. This brings attention to the eerie recurrence of return cycles in ancient traditions. The Maya spoke of long-count intervals ending in the reappearance of sky lords. The Zoroastrians awaited a cosmic event marking the return of a celestial host. Even the Hebrews wrote of watchers who would descend again at the end of the age. These motifs have long been debated, too symbolic for literal interpretation, too widespread to ignore. They echo the possibility that the Anunnaki, despite leaving Nibiru, monitored long cosmic patterns still tied to their former world, and if a civilization once fled a planet condemned by its orbit, they may have spent millennia studying not only star paths but warning signs. Perhaps these ancient return myths contained faint residues of astronomical cycles the Anunnaki knew intimately, cycles tied to Nibiru's wandering fate. Yet beneath all this speculation lies the most intimate question of all. Not why the Anunnaki abandoned their home, not how they survived, but whether the memory of that abandonment altered their very nature. A people shaped by loss often pass that loss forward, through fear, through reverence, through myth. If humanity inherited even a sliver of their sorrow, how much of our own unease with the cosmos, our instinctive awe, our dread of the unknown, might reflect echoes of a world we never saw? And if the Anunnaki did carry such grief across the stars, then what part of that grief still lives within the stories we tell, the symbols we cherish, the fears we cannot name? And what unspoken truth might those echoes still be trying to reveal? There is a peculiar silence woven into the oldest layers of Mesopotamian mythology, a silence that seems to deepen the closer one approaches the question of origins. Not origins of humanity, those stories are plentiful, but the origins of the ones who came before. The Anunnaki are introduced not as newborn deities or emerging forces, but as beings already shaped by a long unnamed history. Every time a tablet refers to their past, it does so with an odd restraint, as if speaking plainly might disturb something fragile. And it is within that restraint that a more unsettling possibility begins to form. Perhaps their past was not glorious, but painful, an inheritance marked by a catastrophe too vast for linear history to hold. Hints of this surface in the Sumerian Kesh Temple hymn, one of the oldest poetic texts humanity possesses. Its verses praise divine order, yet buried within the praise is a cryptic line describing a realm whose foundations were shaken before the counting of years. Scholars typically describe this as mythic flourish, yet when examined beside other early writings, fragments mentioning celestial disturbances, primordial battles and realms thrown into chaos, the line becomes less ornamental and more like a distant echo of something real, a shaken foundation, a fractured cycle, a world that no longer obeyed its own sky. Such descriptions resonate eerily with what modern planetary science reveals about celestial bodies with unstable orbits. When a planet experiences repeated gravitational stresses, whether from a passing star, a massive neighbouring world, or a decaying orbital resonance, its internal structure can undergo violent changes. Magnetic fields weaken. Surface temperatures fluctuate dramatically. Even tectonic plates can shift in unpredictable patterns. For a civilization evolved under such conditions, stability would be a luxury, not an expectation. They would live always on alert, always listening to the subtle tremors of a world that could betray them at any moment. What kind of culture would arise on such a planet? Certainly one fluent in adaptation, one that studied the heavens not out of curiosity but necessity, and perhaps one that eventually recognized that remaining on such a world was no longer viable. This possibility casts the Anunnaki in a different light, not as conquerors seeking power, but as the descendants of survivors who understood too well what happens when a world refuses to remain steady beneath your feet. Archaeological enigmas on Earth reflect the mentality of a people accustomed to instability. Consider the sudden emergence of monumental building techniques in early Mesopotamia. Foundations layered against shifting soil, buttressed walls resistant to tremors, canals designed with redundancy to accommodate unpredictable floods. Ancient Mesopotamians treated nature as something that might turn without warning. This attitude seems inherited rather than invented, almost as if their earliest teachers had known a world where unpredictability was the rule, not the exception. The mythological record deepens the strangeness. In texts like the Enuma Elish, the celestial drama is framed as a struggle to impose order upon chaos, to carve stability out of cosmic turbulence. While many interpret these myths symbolically, the emotion beneath them feels unusually specific. The gods do not fear enemies, they fear disorder. They fear collapse. They fear the sky turning against them. And fear, when encoded into cultural memory, rarely emerges from nothing. But even these threads do not fully unravel why the Anunnaki left Nibiru. For that one must examine a different kind of evidence. The stories that linger around the edges of official mythology, the half-remembered traditions that never found their way onto stone tablets, but survived through whispers, rituals, and symbols. Among these symbols is the mysterious 7-dot motif found across the ancient world, appearing on pottery, seals, temple carvings, even burial goods. Archaeologists typically associate the 7 dots with the Pleiades, a cluster with enormous significance in global mythology. But there is a strange subtlety here. The 7 dots often appear disconnected, with a faint suggestion of motion or drift. In some depictions, 1 dot is separated entirely, as if breaking away. To cultures shaped by a stable sky, stars are fixed points. To a people whose ancestors once lived under a chaotic firmament, drifting stars might symbolize something far more personal, the memory of a world losing its alignment, a cosmic home falling out of sync with familiar constellations. If such imagery was passed to early humans by teachers who carried this memory, then the 7-dot motif may represent not the Pleiades alone, but a deeper longing, a symbol of something once cohesive becoming fractured. Longing also appears at the heart of the myth of Inanna's descent into the underworld. Typically interpreted as an allegory for agricultural cycles or spiritual transformation, it contains unusual details, thresholds sealed behind her, passages where no traveller returns, realms dimmed by the absence of breath. The language carries a strange resonance, almost reminiscent of a world turning cold, a realm sealed off from its former life. Could the myth encode an emotional memory of Nibiru's decline, translated into symbolic form so the truth could be preserved without overwhelming those who heard it? The possibility becomes more intriguing when one considers patterns across unrelated traditions. The Norse spoke of a world tree whose roots trembled when the cosmos shifted. The ancient Japanese described ages when the heavens dimmed under wandering stars. In Polynesian lore, certain islands trace the arrival of ancestors from a land swallowed by darkness. These motifs lack a common origin, yet they carry a shared emotional imprint, the sense of a lost world, a homeland undone by cosmic change. If humanity inherited these themes indirectly through the Anunnaki, or through cultures shaped by memories passed down from them, then the collapse of Nibiru may have echoed through multiple civilizations without ever being named. But the most delicate thread lies in what the Sumerians do not say. In thousands of tablets detailing everything from debt contracts to beer recipes, the origin of the Anunnaki is described with remarkable brevity. It is as if a veil hangs over their beginning. Even kings claiming descent from them speak of the connection with careful distance. Silence in ancient texts is rarely accidental. It is protective. It shields something sacred or traumatic or both. What if the silence surrounding Nibiru is itself a relic of pain? A decision made long ago to leave behind not just a dying world, but the memory of its final days. A decision to speak only in fragments, in symbols, in myths that could be understood without reopening old wounds. And if that silence was intentional, what else did the Anunnaki choose to hide about their world, their fall, or the cost of leaving it behind? Every myth that survives across millennia does so because it carries a pulse, an emotional current strong enough to endure long after names, dates, and places dissolve. When examining the Anunnaki through this lens, their story feels less like a triumphant saga of gods descending to Earth, and more like a soft, unspoken ache woven through human memory. The ache becomes clearest in the places where the tablets fall silent, where a narrative thread tightens and then abruptly vanishes, as if someone long ago paused, reconsidered, and chose not to inscribe more. And in that silence, a question forms. What was buried there, and why? Clues emerge from unexpected corners of the ancient world, especially in traditions that seem to echo memories older than the cultures that carried them. One such clue lies in the earliest Hurrian hymns, songs so ancient that their melodies had to be reconstructed from fragments of notation etched on clay. Among these hymns is a recurring theme describing ancestors who walked under a trembling sky. Scholars translate this metaphorically, suggesting it represents social upheaval or divine wrath. But trembling is an unusual word for a sky. Trembling suggests instability, resonance, vibration, as if the heavens themselves once shuddered in ways visible to the naked eye. When cross-referenced with geological studies, the connection becomes uncanny. Certain cosmic events, intense solar wind interactions, magnetic field fluctuations, or atmospheric ionization caused by nearby celestial bodies, can produce shimmering sky patterns, electromagnetic disturbances, even faint low-frequency sounds. If Nibiru passed through environments like these during its long orbit, its inhabitants may have grown up beneath a sky that literally shook, and if they carried the memory of such a sky to Earth, its echoes might have been woven into the oldest songs of the earliest civilizations, preserved without context, remembered without explanation. The emotional texture of these myths, fearful, reverent, mournful, suggests not admiration for cosmic forces, but trauma born from them. Trauma has a way of travelling across generations and across cultures, encoded in stories, rituals, even architecture. Consider the strange architectural preference for layered, terraced forms seen in ziggurats, Andean temples, and certain Southeast Asian structures. Some researchers argue these represent primordial mountains or cosmic ladders, but others notice their similarity to multi-tiered stabilization structures, designs once used to fortify buildings against tremors or shifting ground. Could such architectural instincts reflect memories carried over from a world where the ground trembled unpredictably? A world like Nibiru? Trauma also reveals itself in the mythic preoccupation with descent, into underworlds, into darkness, into sealed realms. These narratives may symbolize seasonal cycles or spiritual journeys, but their emotional tone is overwhelmingly weighted. Descent is not portrayed as curiosity. It is portrayed as loss. Inanna's descent, Ishtar's descent, the descent of the Apkallu, the descent of those who fell from the heavens. Why is descent always framed with sorrow? Why do the stories insist that those who descend change irrevocably, as if they have crossed a boundary that should not have been crossed? If the Anunnaki endured the collapse of their world, or remained witness to a slow, relentless decline, then descent may have become a metaphor for watching one's home fall into ruin, for passing from a realm of life into a realm where survival shrinks with each passing century, for crossing from familiarity into the unknown. And if those who left Nibiru arrived on Earth carrying such grief, their myths may reflect the psychological echoes of that passage, preserved long after the details were forgotten. The emotional imprint deepens when one examines the peculiar way the Anunnaki interacted with humanity, not as conquerors enforcing rigid hierarchies, but as instructors who seemed driven by urgency. The earlier cities show signs of intense knowledge transfer, agricultural methods perfected abruptly, astronomical systems introduced fully formed, legal structures appearing with baked-in wisdom usually developed over centuries. This kind of rapid instruction suggests not leisurely guidance, but a hurried passing of knowledge, as if time was running out, as if something they had witnessed before, something catastrophic, unavoidable, might one day repeat here. Indeed, the Sumerian concept of me, the divine laws or fundamental principles governing civilization, reads less like a list of mystical artifacts and more like a survival manual. Each me corresponds to an essential function of a stable society: agriculture, kingship, justice, craftsmanship, even emotional expression. The Anunnaki did not deliver miracles, they delivered structures that would endure even if the teachers themselves vanished. Yet the myths insist the me was stored in the Abzu, the deep. Not the heavens, not Nibiru, the deep. A place associated with hidden knowledge, forgotten worlds, and truths too heavy to confront. If the Anunnaki viewed the lessons of their past as burdensome, perhaps they hid them symbolically in the deep to prevent future generations from being overwhelmed. Knowledge preserved, but submerged, accessible, but only through great effort. Another strand emerges in the recurring phrase, the gods who decreed destiny. In ancient literature, destiny is not fate in the modern sense. It is trajectory, path, course, a celestial line drawn through time. The Anunnaki's obsession with destiny might reflect their own experience watching their world's trajectory drift into peril, an inevitability they could not stop. If so, their warnings to early humans about maintaining order, balance, and humility before the cosmos may have been shaped by hard-won lessons from Nibiru's downfall. But perhaps the most haunting detail lies in the persistence of one particular mythological idea, the notion that the gods will not return the way they left. This phrase appears in Sumerian laments, Akkadian prayers, and later Assyrian rituals. It suggests not just departure, but transformation, a one-way passage, a path altered by sorrow. If the Anunnaki left Nibiru because it was dying, or because they could not bear to witness its last collapse, then the act of leaving may have changed them permanently. Survivors who abandon their birthplace often carry an invisible fracture within them. Cultures shaped by exile behave differently. Their stories become tinged with longing. Their teachings become warnings. Their silences become the most revealing part of their legacy. Which leaves one final question lingering like a thin thread across the ages. If the Anunnaki were forever changed by losing their home, then how much of that loss did they pass on to humanity? And how much still shapes the way we fear the heavens, long for answers, and wonder what truly happened to the world they left behind. If one listens closely to the oldest myths, not to their words but to the tremor beneath them, an unsettling pattern begins to appear. It is the pattern of something unfinished, something carried from a place far older than any human city. The Anunnaki arrive in Sumerian stories fully formed, with hierarchies, memories, and rivalries already in place. Myths do not show them learning, growing, or emerging. They appear already burdened, as if the history that shaped them happened somewhere else, somewhere they no longer wish to name. In the ruins of Nibiru, a tablet known as the Song of the Plough contains a strange verse describing the gods searching for stable ground. This is an odd metaphor for divine beings. Why would gods need stable ground? Some scholars argue the phrase refers to the founding of agriculture. Others see it as a symbolic reference to order amid chaos. But a few researchers have quietly asked a different question. What if the phrase reflects an inherited memory of life on a planet where stable ground was never guaranteed? Modern astronomical research confirms that planets with highly elliptical orbits undergo repeated tidal stresses as they swing through varying gravitational fields. These stresses can fracture crusts, destabilize tectonic plates, and trigger quakes so frequent that stability becomes a luxury. If Nibiru was such a world, its inhabitants would have experienced terrain that shifted unpredictably. A planet where searching for stable ground was not a metaphor, but a daily reality. Such an environment shapes culture in profound ways. It teaches vigilance, it teaches humility, and it teaches a painful truth. Nothing built lasts forever when the ground itself is uncertain. Could this be why the earliest Sumerian cities, despite their extraordinary innovation, also carried a deep preoccupation with transience? Their hymns praise permanence, yet their cosmology brims with reminders of impermanence. The Anunnaki introduced kingship, architecture, astronomy, but always with a sober awareness of cycles, collapses, returns, as if reminding humanity of something they themselves had learned painfully. This awareness surfaces again in the enigmatic Apkallu, semi-divine beings who brought knowledge to humanity after a great catastrophe. Some versions describe them as fish-cloaked sages emerging from the deep. Others portray them as watchers standing at the threshold between worlds. Their role is always the same, to rebuild what was lost. Yet their presence is temporary. They appear, they teach, they depart. No myth ever explains why they leave. Historians often interpret the Apkallu as cultural heroes, but another interpretation lies beneath. What if they were emissaries of a people who understood too well that their presence could not last? Refugees rarely remain visible for long. They help stabilize, then disperse. Their knowledge survives, but their origins blur. This blurring becomes even more intriguing when one examines the overlapping flood traditions of the ancient Near East. The Sumerian flood, the Akkadian flood, the Hebrew flood. Each includes a striking detail. The gods lament the destruction not because it harms humanity, but because it destroys memory. Tablets, temples, cities, lost. The cries of the gods after the flood in the Atreus' epic sound less like divine regret, and more like the grief of a people who had already lived through the destruction of their own world. A second loss becomes unbearable. If the Anunnaki had witnessed the slow ruin of Nibiru, then the flood on Earth may have awakened ancient wounds. Their laments, preserved in clay, might be echoes of a deeper sorrow, the fear of losing everything again. This pattern of inherited trauma appears not only in stories, but in symbols. The enigmatic rope pattern seen on cylinder seals, often interpreted as cosmic threads, bears an uncanny resemblance to early astronomical diagrams of orbital cycles. Some archaeologists believe the patterns symbolize fate or divine control. But what if they depict something more literal, an unstable orbit, a cosmic path crossing in and out of harmony with the solar system? If Nibiru's orbit carried it periodically into perilous alignments, then its people would have lived according to celestial cycles far more dangerous than any Earth-based calendar could convey. Their descendants, teaching early humans, may have preserved this cosmic awareness through symbolic motifs rather than direct explanation. It becomes even more unsettling when one considers the peculiar Sumerian obsession with measuring time. They tracked not just lunar and solar movements, but long cycles, the kind relevant only to civilizations that experience deep catastrophic periodicity. Why did a river valley civilization care about cycles spanning millennia? Why maintain records of celestial bodies that only appear once every few generations? Something about time mattered to them in a way that feels inherited, not invented. Perhaps the Anunnaki taught humanity to measure time meticulously, because they had lived through cycles that destroyed civilizations. Perhaps they hoped humans might avoid the fate that befell their own world. And perhaps this urgency is why their myths emphasize maintaining order, preserving balance, and resisting hubris, messages that read like warnings disguised as theology. Yet, despite all these hints, the deepest mystery remains the emotional tone of the Anunnaki narrative. Their interactions with humanity do not evoke joy at beginning anew. They feel cautious, fragmented, occasionally conflicted. Myths speak of disagreements among them, debates over Earth, over humans, over destiny. Some align with Enki, protector and teacher. Others align with Enlil, stern guardian of order. Neither side is portrayed as wholly right or wrong. Their conflict feels familiar, not mythical, but human. The conflict of people who have lost their home and cannot agree how to move forward. A divided people, a fractured memory, a wound carried across the stars. Loneliness threads through their stories as well. Many ancient texts describe houses of the gods standing empty for long ages, waiting for their return. This absence is explained symbolically in most interpretations. But read through the lens of exile, it feels different. Empty houses, absent teachers, a people who came but did not stay. Perhaps they could not stay. Perhaps they were searching. Perhaps they hoped Earth might become a new home, but could not shake the memory of the world they left behind. And this brings forth a final quiet question. A question that has drifted like a shadow across human mythology for thousands of years. If the Anunnaki abandoned Nibiru because it could no longer sustain life, then did they ever truly find a new home? Or have they been wandering ever since, carrying the memory of a dying world that still echoes faintly through the stories humanity struggles to interpret? When exploring the oldest Mesopotamian myths, there is a moment when the narrative stops feeling like legend and begins to resemble a confession, one offered through layers of metaphor, silence, and symbolic gestures. Nowhere is this more apparent than in the stories describing the age before humanity, an era in which the Anunnaki lived through trials that remain unnamed, referenced only through emotional residue rather than explicit detail. And it is within this residue, this lingering sense of something half-hidden, that the mystery of their departure from Nibiru deepens into something more intimate. Consider the strange way the Sumerians spoke of the heavens. Unlike other ancient cultures that celebrated the sky as a realm of constancy, the Mesopotamians approached it with caution. Their oldest star lists include warnings, not praises. Their omens do not simply predict earthly events. They interpret the behavior of celestial bodies as signs of imbalance, disruption, or danger. This preoccupation feels inherited, not observational. It is unlikely a river valley civilization would have developed such cosmic anxiety on its own. Something about their teachers, or the stories their teachers carried, shaped a worldview in which the sky was remembered as a place that once threatened life rather than nurtured it. This anxiety crystallizes in one of the most enigmatic Sumerian motifs, the Tablet of Destinies. Scholars interpret it as a symbol of divine authority or cosmic order. Yet its function, granting the ability to control or stabilize the fates of gods and men, feels strangely technical. Not mystical, but procedural. Almost as if it represents ancient knowledge concerning cycles, alignments, or trajectories, the kind of knowledge a civilization might develop after watching its world drift into catastrophic instability. If the Anunnaki once possessed a system for tracking the fate of their own planet, it might have been remembered in myth as an object of tremendous power, a tablet capable of ordering the universe. But even more intriguing is the fact that this tablet can be stolen in the myths. Order can be disrupted, stability can be lost. In some versions, chaos breaks loose when the tablet shifts hands, a symbolic echo, perhaps, of the moment when Nibiru's fate slipped beyond the control of its inhabitants. What the myths portray as divine conflict may conceal a memory of scientific failure, a mistake or miscalculation that set their world on an irreversible path. This idea becomes heavier when we turn to the legend of Enki creating humans to bear the labour that gods no longer wish to perform. Most interpret this as symbolic of administrative hierarchy, but another reading suggests something more practical. A civilization under immense strain might delegate tasks not out of laziness, but necessity. A world in decline produces urgency, scarcity, and desperation. If the Anunnaki arrived on Earth as a fractured people, exhausted by cycles of devastation, then their interactions with humanity reflect not superiority, but survival. Teaching humans agriculture, writing, governance, these might have been acts of preservation, not domination. By helping a new species flourish, they ensured that some fragment of their own knowledge, their own legacy, would survive even if they could not remain. This urgency appears again in the myths describing how the divine craftsmen, the Anunnaki associated with knowledge, retreated into hidden places, the Apkallu returning to the deep, the seven sages leaving behind only their student Adapa, deities withdrawing from public life after the flood. Why did these figures not stay? Why did they hide their knowledge rather than continue to guide directly? One possibility is that they feared repeating whatever mistake or catastrophe had occurred on Nibiru. A civilization that witnessed its own decline might adopt a philosophy of indirect influence, offering knowledge but refusing to rule, teaching but avoiding entanglement, allowing a younger species to rise without becoming dependent. This interpretation casts the Anunnaki in a bittersweet light. Not gods, not tyrants, but weary survivors afraid of leading another world into ruin. Another clue lies in the way Sumerians describe the divine breath. While often associated with life force or inspiration, the earliest descriptions frame this breath as something fragile, almost damaged. Breath broken, breath carried from afar, breath thinned by the wind of the high places. These phrases defy simple interpretation, yet when viewed against the possibility of a failing atmosphere on Nibiru, they take on a haunting meaning. A planet with thinning air, collapsing climate systems and toxic cycles would shape every aspect of its inhabitants' culture. Breath would become sacred, survival would become ritual, and those who escaped such a world would forever remember the fragility of life. This fragility may also explain the Anunnaki's fracturing into factions. Enlil, the stern guardian of order, seems driven by fear of losing control. Enki, the compassionate teacher, seems driven by fear of repeating the past. Inanna, the ambitious and restless one, embodies the yearning for renewal. Their conflicts feel less like mythic drama and more like the internal struggles of a displaced people unsure how to rebuild. Perhaps the most evocative clue lies in a small fragment from the Lament for Ur, where the gods declare, "We could not return to the place before." The line is usually interpreted metaphorically, meaning a lost age of prosperity, but the phrasing is curious. The place before, not the kingdom before, nor the order before, but a place, a location, a home that cannot be revisited. If this line preserves even a faint whisper of truth, then the Anunnaki's departure from Nibiru was final. They could not go back, not because they lacked the ability, but because there was nothing left to return to. A world undone by cosmic forces, abandoned out of necessity, mourned through centuries of myth disguised as theology. This interpretation reshapes the mythic landscape. The tales of destruction, floods, fires, cosmic battles become less warnings of divine wrath and more reflections of the sorrow carried by those who had already lost their own world. Humanity may have inherited the emotional memory of a catastrophe it never experienced, preserved through the teachings of exiles who could not speak plainly of their past, and this leaves a final lingering question drifting like dust in the space between stars. If the Anunnaki fled a dying world and carried its memory into human civilization, then what part of their grief, unspoken, unresolved, still lingers in the way humanity fears endings, searches the heavens, and wonders whether some cosmic echo is waiting even now to repeat itself? There comes a point in the study of these ancient narratives when the boundary between history and memory blurs, when the stories of the Anunnaki begin to feel less like distant myth and more like inherited emotion, something carried unconsciously through generations. This becomes especially clear in the peculiar way ancient texts describe the moment of separation between the Anunnaki and the world that birthed them. The tablets never state outright why they left Nibiru. yet every detail surrounding their departure carries a faint tremor, as if the scribes preserved not the event itself, but the ache that followed it. That ache appears in the Sumerian laments, songs etched in clay after the fall of cities like Ur, Eridu, and Nippur. These laments grieve human suffering, but woven through them is a deeper sorrow, directed not at the destruction itself, but at the feeling of something lost forever. Phrases like, "The bond with the heavens is broken," or "The ancient path cannot be walked again," suggest a memory older than any earthly city. It is as though the grief expressed in these songs is a reflection of an earlier unspoken loss, one that the Anunnaki themselves carried into the world of humans, and it is in these laments that a strange pattern emerges, a repeated emphasis on exile. Exile not as punishment, but as condition. The lords who no longer dwell in their place, the gods who wander, those who search for rest. These lines are usually interpreted symbolically, as metaphors for divine withdrawal after catastrophe. Yet the consistency of this theme across thousands of years hints at something else. Perhaps the Anunnaki truly were exiles long before they touched the soil of Earth. If so, the question becomes, what does a civilization carry with it when it abandons its world? Archaeological evidence suggests the answer is not merely tools or knowledge, but trauma. Trauma becomes encoded into art, ritual, and cosmology. And when a displaced people teach a younger civilization, their memories, however disguised, travel with their teachings. This may explain one of the great puzzles of early civilization, the sudden emergence of advanced knowledge, agriculture, metallurgy, mathematics, writing. These innovations appear in Sumer not as gradual developments, but as fully formed systems. Scholars attribute this to urbanization, population growth, or environmental pressure. But another possibility lingers. Perhaps the Anunnaki, shaped by the instability of their own planet, transferred a knowledge base built over millennia of surviving cosmic cycles. The precision of the Sumerian calendar suggests the same. It tracks not only lunar months and solar years, but long cycles. Cycles meaningful only to a civilization familiar with drastic astronomical shifts. Why would a river valley society require knowledge of multimillennial celestial patterns, unless such patterns had once carried existential significance? Perhaps this awareness was inherited from teachers who had survived a world where long cycles determined life and death. Even their myths of cosmic conflict, Tiamat's disruption, the battles of the Igigi, the chaos unleashed when the tablet of destinies changed hands, feel less like allegories for natural forces and more like encoded memories of instability. Myths often refract trauma into story, and when trauma comes from the sky itself, from a world whose orbit betrayed its inhabitants, the stories that survive will inevitably frame the heavens as both teacher and threat. This cosmic anxiety becomes especially clear in the strange reverence ancient cultures held for alignments. Ziggurats, pyramids, megaliths, all oriented with precision that suggests more than symbolic meaning. These structures point not merely to stars but to specific cycles, conjunctions, and paths. If the Anunnaki once lived under a sky whose dangers were predictable only through careful astronomical study, they would have carried this vigilance into their teachings. Humans, inheriting this vigilance without understanding its origin, may have preserved it through architecture meant to watch the heavens for signs they no longer knew how to interpret. The emotional imprint of this vigilance appears again in one of the oldest stories known to humanity, the Epic of Gilgamesh. When Gilgamesh seeks immortality, he approaches Utnapishtim, the survivor of the Great Flood. But the flood is not framed as moral punishment. It is described as a failure of balance, as if the world simply slipped out of its intended path. Utnapishtim speaks of gods who trembled, fled and wept during the catastrophe. Gods who were powerless, fragile, fearful. This is not divine wrath, it is cosmic helplessness. It hints at memories of earlier disasters, perhaps even memories transplanted from another world entirely. If the Anunnaki carried fear from Nibiru into Earth's mythology, one wonders how much of that fear remains encoded in our modern imagination. Humans continue to look at the sky with both awe and dread. We build telescopes to search for distant worlds, yet our stories fixate on cosmic disaster. Collisions, extinctions, endings. It is as if something buried in our psychological inheritance warns us that planets are fragile, Orbits can fail, and worlds can die. This inherited fear might also explain why ancient cultures spoke of the return, not the triumphant return of gods, but the return of cycles, the return of a threat, the return of something once escaped. Across civilizations, Maya, Vedic, Greek, Persian, there exists a belief that cosmic cycles repeat, that ages end and begin with celestial upheaval. These beliefs are often dismissed as mythic archetypes, but perhaps they arise from memories older than Earth's civilizations, carried by teachers who had watched their world collapse under cyclical forces they could not escape. And so, the unanswered question remains: if the Anunnaki abandoned Nibiru because its cycles turned deadly, then did they fear the same might one day happen here? Did they see in Earth a possibility for renewal, or a temporary refuge from a pattern that could not be outrun? The myths do not answer these questions directly, but they leave traces of caution, sorrow, and urgency, as if hinting that the story of Nibiru's fate is not simply history, but warning. Which leads to one final thought, one unsettling and tender at once. If the Anunnaki carried with them the memory of a dying sky, then how much of that memory have we unknowingly woven into our own understanding of the universe? And what deeper truth might still be hidden in the silence that surrounds the story of the world they left behind? Among all the enigmas surrounding the Anunnaki, none is more haunting than the way their presence seems to fade as human civilization matures. They enter the earliest chapters of human history like echoes of an older age, guiding, warning, structuring, and then slowly retreat into symbol, ritual, and memory. This retreat is not described as defeat or death. It is described as withdrawal, as if a chapter closed silently, intentionally, without explanation. And within that silence lies an emotional imprint suggesting that the Anunnaki did not simply leave Earth. They were already accustomed to leaving. The Sumerians spoke of the Namlugal, the divine mandate of kingship, descending from the heavens again and again. Yet the texts insist this descent occurred only at the beginning of each age, never continuously. It suggests a pattern of intermittent presence, as though the Anunnaki appeared only when necessary, only when some cosmic interval aligned. This raises a subtle but profound question. Were they following the cycles of Earth, or following the remnants of the cycles that once defined Nibiru's unstable orbit? These cycles may explain why the earliest myths frame the gods not as creators of the world, but as restorers. They do not make the cosmos, they maintain it. They do not form humanity from nothing, they modify what already exists. They arrive not to begin a story, but to stabilize one already in motion. And their departure feels less like abandonment than repetition, another turning of a pattern that predated even their arrival. If the Anunnaki once lived on a world where life was defined by long, dangerous cycles, then their instinct to intervene only periodically makes sense. A people shaped by instability would develop a worldview in which nothing remains constant, where departure is as natural as arrival, and where the only true legacy is what endures after one leaves. This worldview becomes particularly vivid when we examine the myths describing the divine boats, vehicles that transport gods across realms. In Sumerian art, these boats hover in the sky, their curved hulls encircled by stars. While modern readers often interpret them as poetic expressions of celestial movement, their technical precision unsettles scholars. The carvings depict detachable components, stabilizing fins, and cross-bracing patterns uncommon in symbolic imagery. Similar motifs appear in Egyptian depictions of the solar bark, and in the Indus Valley seals showing multi-tiered vessels surrounded by radiating lines. The recurrence of this imagery raises the possibility that these boats represent not otherworldly metaphors, but inherited memories of migration, echoes of a journey the Anunnaki once undertook out of necessity. If Nibiru was collapsing, they would have needed a means of transport capable of sustaining life across immense cosmic distances, and if the instinct to commemorate that journey survived, it would survive in the form of symbols humans later interpreted according to their own limited understanding. Migration also offers a new lens through which to view the persistent myth of the gods who left, promising to return. Many civilizations carry versions of this motif: the Maya, the Hopi, the Inca, the Maori, the Dogon, the Egyptians. The figures differ, but the message is identical. Those who once taught humanity will one day come again, not as conquerors, but as witnesses to another turning of an age. If the Anunnaki followed cyclical patterns rooted in their own planetary history, the idea of return may not be prophecy or superstition. It may be inherited memory, a cultural imprint of a people who reappeared in rhythms determined by cosmic motion. But the question remains, why did they withdraw? Why not remain among the humans they taught? One possibility lies in the emotional patterns encoded in their myths. The Anunnaki consistently express fear, not of humanity, nor of rebellion, but of disorder. Every major conflict in their stories revolves around maintaining balance, preventing chaos, or averting catastrophe. These are the obsessions of a people who lived through planetary collapse. Their caution may have compelled them to limit their interference on Earth, fearing that too direct a role might destabilize another world the way theirs had been destabilized. Their withdrawal may also reflect guilt. Myths describe disagreements among them about humanity's purpose. Some believed humans should be guided with care, others believed they posed a risk. If their own world fell partly due to internal conflict or ecological strain, then humanity might have represented a chance to correct their mistakes, or a reminder of failures they could not bear to revisit. Retreat, then, becomes an act of self-preservation as much as it is an act of protection. Interestingly, traces of this withdrawal linger in the archaeological record. In the late Akkadian period, inscriptions speak of the silence of the gods, a time when divine communication ceased abruptly. Cities that once claimed patron deities record that their temples felt empty, their rituals unheard. Such descriptions mirror the emotional landscape of cultural trauma, communities grappling with the sudden loss of contact with beings they believed had once guided them. Whether the Anunnaki truly withdrew, or whether cultural shifts simply changed the narrative, the psychological imprint is undeniable. Humanity felt abandoned yet did not accuse. They mourned. This mournful tone appears elsewhere, in the strange lullaby-like incantations used to soothe fears during eclipses, storms, or earthquakes. These chants describe the heavens remembering their wounds, or shifting in sorrow. Scholars interpret this as poetic embellishment, but viewed through the lens of inherited memory, they resemble fragments of an older grief, echoes of a time when the sky itself was unstable, when celestial events carried existential danger. It is this grief, quiet, persistent, almost reverent, that permeates the way humans came to view the heavens, not with pure wonder, not with pure terror, but with a kind of longing, an inexplicable sense that something important was lost there, something that once mattered deeply. Perhaps this longing is not wholly human. Perhaps it is the faint residue of a people who lost their own sky and could never fully embrace another. Perhaps the Anunnaki, even after leaving Nibiru and teaching early civilizations, never truly found a new home, and their restlessness became part of the myths they left behind. Which leads to a final whisper of a possibility. If the withdrawal of the Anunnaki reflects not departure but continuation, another turn of the cycle that once shaped their world, then what happens when that cycle turns again? And what echoes of Nibiru's fate might still linger, waiting for us to recognize them? There is a particular stillness in the ancient world's memory of the Anunnaki, a stillness not born of absence, but of something deliberately set aside, as though those who once walked among early humans carried within them a grief so vast it could not be spoken directly, but could only be expressed in symbols, metaphors, and whispered warnings. In part 12 of this long journey, that stillness becomes the focus, for it is within the quiet spaces of myth, the pauses, the ellipses, the half-finished lines, that the clearest hints of Nibiru's fate seem to hide. One of these quiet spaces appears in the Sumerian incantation texts known as the Ushumgal hymns. Their purpose was practical, rituals to restore balance, ward off misfortune, or mend a broken order. But embedded within them is a strange recurring phrase, the memory of the first separation. Scribes copied it for centuries without explanation, as if its meaning had already evaporated by the time they wrote it down. Scholars typically assume it refers to the separation of heaven and earth at creation. Yet the emotional tone of the phrase does not match a celebratory origin myth. It feels mournful. Something was separated, not formed. Something was lost, not made. The deeper one follows this phrase, the more it begins to resemble a distant echo of a people forced to leave their world behind. A separation not from gods, but by gods. A divide not between cosmos and earth, but between a home that could no longer sustain life and a new home that could not fully replace it. This interpretation finds resonance in another curious detail. The Sumerian word Kur, often translated as mountain or foreign land. But earlier uses of the word, those closest to the oldest layers of myth, carry meanings associated with the place of no return, the distant realm, the land beneath memory. While later cultures identified Kur with the underworld, the earliest contexts imply something else. Not an afterlife, but a foreign world once familiar, now inaccessible. A place sealed off, not by death, but by distance. If Nibiru became uninhabitable, Kur might be a symbolic vestige of that world, a name whispered only indirectly, preserved through metaphor rather than history. This longing also surfaces in the way ancient civilizations described the departure of their gods. When the Anunnaki withdrew from human affairs, the event was never portrayed as abandonment. It was portrayed as inevitability. They returned to their far-off dwelling, says one Babylonian text. They went to the place before beginnings, says another. The implication is not that they left abruptly, but that they were returning to a state that had existed before they appeared on Earth. A state of wandering, a state of exile. This theme of perpetual wandering appears across unrelated cultures. The Hopi speak of the people of the sky who walk between homes. The Dogon recount visitors who left one world because it dimmed. Norse poems describe the Vanir, deities who arrived from afar, only to return after a treaty, carrying memories of a lost realm. These parallels do not prove contact. They do, however, suggest that early human imagination was profoundly shaped by the idea of beings torn from their origin, seeking safety in a new world. This emotional undercurrent becomes sharper when examining the mythic figure of Enki, arguably the most compassionate of the Anunnaki and the one most closely associated with teaching humanity. What makes Enki unusual in ancient mythology is the tension between his wisdom and his sorrow. Unlike many divine figures across cultures who embody triumph or dominion, Enki's narrative is threaded with quiet grief. He repeatedly intervenes to help humanity survive calamities, floods, droughts, famine, as though trying to prevent them from repeating the mistakes of another world. He protects, yet he mourns. He instructs, yet he withdraws. He feels like a survivor who cannot bear to watch destruction unfold again. This emotional complexity hints at something unspoken. Perhaps Enki, like others of his kind, carried a memory of Nibiru's decline so vivid that protecting humanity became a way of atoning for what he could not save on his own world. If Nibiru's fate was shaped by environmental failure, internal conflict, or cosmic forces beyond control, then the Anunnaki's interactions with early humans may have been driven as much by guilt as by purpose. This interpretation gains weight when one considers the strange role of the Igigi in Mesopotamian myth. The Igigi are portrayed as labourers, watchers, assistants to the Anunnaki, but their resentment, rebellion, and eventual disappearance from the text suggest something more complicated. They are described as gods who lost their place, those whose tears filled the rivers, those who could not bear the burden. Their story reads less like a mythic revolt and more like a recollection of societal breakdown, perhaps a memory of an underclass on Nibiru, unable to endure the catastrophic shifts of their failing world. If the Igigi suffered most during Nibiru's collapse, their trauma might have echoed through generations, manifesting on Earth as reluctance to remain, inability to trust stability, fear of repeating the past. These fears may have influenced the Anunnaki's decision to limit their involvement in human affairs. A civilization scarred by its own downfall would be wary of creating dependency, hierarchy, or imbalance in another world. And yet, despite their caution, sorrow, and fragmentary presence, the Anunnaki's legacy endured, not through monuments or temples, but through something subtler, humanity's instinctive fascination with the heavens. Across every ancient culture, the sky becomes the ultimate symbol, not only of divinity, but of origin, destiny, and loss. People look upward not merely with wonder, but with longing. as if somewhere within the collective unconscious lies a shadow memory of a world lost long before Earth knew human footsteps. This raises an unsettling possibility. Humanity's oldest questions, where did we come from? Why are we here? What lies beyond the stars? May echo questions once asked by beings who had already lost their home and could not bear for those memories to die with them. And so the silence surrounding Nibiru, its absence from explicit history, its shrouding in myth, its reduction to riddles, may not be concealment for power or secrecy. It may be a wound carried across light years, preserved through metaphor, softened only by the passage of time and the resilience of human imagination. Which leads to one final, haunting question. If the Anunnaki once fled a dying world, embedding fragments of their story into the earliest layers of human memory, then what part of that story still lies hidden? Not in tablets, not in ruins, but in the quiet ways humanity fears loss, reveres the sky, and feels an inexplicable yearning for a home we have never seen. There is a moment when, tracing the Anunnaki's shadow across the oldest layers of human memory, when the narrative stops feeling like a tale of cosmic migration and begins to resemble something far more delicate, a story of a people trying, in quiet ways, to protect others from repeating their fate. If Nibiru truly fell into ruin, then the Anunnaki's presence on Earth may have been shaped not merely by survival, but by a desperate wish to prevent another world from collapsing under the same invisible pressures. And in Part 13, this wish, this almost parental caution, reveals itself most clearly in the myths surrounding the earliest attempts to organize human society. One of the strangest features of Sumerian culture is how abruptly and completely complex systems appeared. Irrigation networks precise enough to sustain cities in an unpredictable climate, astronomical charts capable of forecasting celestial movements, written laws establishing balance between classes, rituals designed to maintain order between humanity and the environment. Scholars attribute this sudden leap to environmental necessity. But necessity alone does not explain why these systems were introduced with such philosophical weight. The earliest tablets frame their innovations not as achievements, but as responsibilities, as burdens, as if the ones who taught them had learned, painfully, that survival depends as much on restraint as on knowledge. This tone of caution becomes unmistakable when examining the myth of Adapa, the first sage. In the tale, Adapa is granted wisdom but denied immortality. Scholars often interpret this as a parable about human limits. Yet another interpretation emerges when the emotional subtext is considered. Adapa is denied immortality not to punish him, but to protect him, to save him from the weight of endless time long enough to witness the collapse of worlds. It is as if the Anunnaki, remembering the slow death of Nibiru, feared that granting immortality would trap humanity in a story haunted by memories not their own. This protective instinct surfaces again in the laws of Urnamu, among the oldest legal codes in the world. Unlike later laws built on judgment and retribution, the earliest laws emphasize compensation, restoration, balance. They read less like decrees and more like lessons, guidelines from teachers who had lived through societal fracture and understood how easily civilizations can unravel when inequity grows too great. If the Anunnaki once endured internal divisions during Nibiru's decline, divisions hinted at in the conflicts between Enlil and Enki, the rebellion of the Igigi, and the laments describing those who lost their place, then their early focus on justice for humans may reflect a desire to correct what they could not repair on their own world. The emotional resonance of this interpretation deepens when one examines the global ubiquity of the Watchers, figures present in Mesopotamian, Hebrew, Greek, and even Polynesian traditions. These beings do not rule, they observe. They intervene only when balance is threatened. They are guardians, not sovereigns. They watch from a distance as though afraid that too close an involvement might cause disruption rather than stability. This mirrors the behavior of a people cautious from experience, survivors wary of repeating old mistakes. Another thread emerges in the puzzling fragments of the Kutha legend, which describe a world scorched at its edge, a people seeking refuge from a storm of ages, and beings who crossed the great void when the breath of their land grew thin. Some assume these are poetic allegories for drought or political upheaval, yet when read alongside the global prevalence of myths describing travellers from the fading horizon, from the dying land, or from the sky that grew cold, the fragments seem to retain the faint outline of something older, the memory of a world losing its vitality. If Nibiru succumbed to atmospheric collapse, cosmic instability, or geological decay, then those who fled would have carried that memory into every new place they lived, and their teachings, scientific, agricultural, moral, would be shaped by this memory. They would teach humans how to live not as conquerors of the land, but as stewards, how to survive not by dominance but cooperation, and how to avoid the dangers of imbalance that once doomed their own world. This possibility casts a new light on the Sumerian concept of me, the fundamental principles that govern civilization. Some me describe virtues, truth, justice, compassion. Others describe institutions, kingship, artistry, craftsmanship. But woven among them are principles that seem less cultural and more existential. The me of the wandering star, the me of the lost house, the me of the diminishing breath. These three, rarely discussed by scholars, appear in later lists as corrupted or fragmentary entries. Their meanings are unclear. Yet their phrasing suggests something more than metaphor. Traces of cosmic conditions that once shaped the lives of those who taught these principles to humanity. If the Anunnaki preserved aspects of Nibiru's story through symbolic me, it would explain why some principles appear oddly out of place in a young civilization. Why include the me of the wandering star in a list meant to govern cities and farms? Unless it was not symbolic at all, but a preserved memory of a world that wandered too far, too long. Another detail deepens this sense of inherited memory, the Sumerian fear of forgetting. Their scribes repeat warnings about the fragility of memory, the danger of losing stories, the importance of transmitting knowledge across generations. This is not merely the mindset of an early civilization. It feels like the psychological imprint of a people who once watched their own archives destroyed, their own histories erased by cosmic forces. A people who remembered the pain of forgetting and tried to ensure that humanity would not inherit the same fate. And so, humanity became the vessel for their memories, not clearly, not explicitly, but through metaphor, myth, and emotional residue. Through stories of gods who mourn, who warn, who withdraw, who return only when cycles turn, through symbols of wandering, through rituals of balance, through architecture aligned to the heavens. If the Anunnaki fled Nibiru not simply to survive, but to preserve the lessons of their own downfall, then humanity's earlier civilizations were shaped by more than knowledge. They were shaped by inherited grief. This leads to the question that lingers like a soft breath at the edge of every tablet, every myth, every half-remembered story. If the Anunnaki came to Earth carrying the memory of a world lost to imbalance, then what did they fear humanity might one day repeat? And what unspoken warnings did they hide within the myths we have spent thousands of years trying to interpret? As the trail of the Anunnaki winds deeper into humanity's earliest memories, their presence begins to resemble a kind of shadow education. Less a doctrine, more a long echo of experience left quietly in our stories, symbols and instincts. By part 14, this echo feels almost deliberate, as though the Anunnaki shaped early human civilization while simultaneously trying to ensure that their own past would never be repeated. Yet the more one looks at the patterns they left behind, the more a quiet unease surfaces. Perhaps what they feared most was not humanity's failure, but humanity's success. A success that could one day lead us into the same trap that once consumed Nibiru. This unease becomes visible when examining the earliest Sumerian king lists. These lists stretch backward into a fog of impossibly long reigns, kings who ruled for thousands of years before the flood. Scholars treat these numbers symbolically, but the structure of the list reveals something else, a deliberate effort to mark a distinction between the age before the flood and the age after. That division is not merely chronological, it is ideological. Something changed, something significant enough that the scribes needed to draw a boundary, as though the world before and the world after were fundamentally different. If Nibiru's decline was slow and cyclical, then its people would have lived through multiple turning points, periods when everything changed, when the old world could no longer sustain itself, and a new world had to be constructed from what remained. It is possible that the Sumerian king list reflects an echo of this worldview. Age is defined not by years but by thresholds, times when civilizations must transform or collapse. This echo also appears in the way the Sumerians conceived of knowledge, Unlike later civilizations that saw knowledge as accumulation, the Sumerians viewed it as equilibrium. Wisdom was not measured by innovation, but by alignment. Alignment with the me, with cycles, with cosmic patterns. Too much growth without restraint, too much ambition without balance, was considered dangerous. This notion of restrained advancement feels strangely modern, as if inherited from a people who had already witnessed what uncontrolled progress could do to a fragile world. Perhaps this is why the myth of Inanna stealing the me from Eridu carries such a complex emotional tone. The story is not about greed or rebellion. It is about imbalance, about knowledge taken without the maturity to wield it. The consequences in the myth are immediate. Chaos spreads, cities become unstable, equilibrium collapses. Scholars usually read the tale as a metaphor for urban expansion, but what if it is older than that? What if it is a memory of Nibiru's final centuries, when factions competed for control, when technologies were pushed beyond sustainability, when the planet's fragile systems reached a breaking point? This idea gains weight when examining the strange recurring warnings embedded in Middle Eastern myth. The Akkadian omen texts, for example, are less concerned with predicting petty misfortunes, and more focused on detecting signs of environmental or celestial imbalance. They warn of skies dimming, winds shifting, stars deviating from their expected paths. These warnings are written with urgency, as if based on traumatic experience. The tone is not mythic wonder, it is vigilance. The vigilance of a people who once lived under a sky that betrayed them. Such vigilance appears in other cultures as well. The ancient Maya tracked long count cycles with precision that still astonishes modern researchers. The Vedic texts obsess over cosmic ages and the rise and fall of worlds. The Egyptians described the Zep Tepi, the first time, as an age when the gods rebuilt after catastrophe. These global parallels do not indicate a unified origin, but they suggest that early human civilizations inherited a worldview framed by cycles of rise and collapse, a worldview that may have been seeded, intentionally or not, by survivors of Nibiru's demise. Another thread deepens the sense of inherited caution, the peculiar Sumerian fear of the unbounded. In their cosmology, everything dangerous is described as boundless. Boundless waters, boundless winds, boundless stars. Boundaries meant safety, limits meant survival. In a stable world, boundaries need not be sacred. In an unstable one, boundaries are everything. The reverence for boundaries hints at a past where imbalance was fatal, where ecosystems collapsed when limits were crossed, where one misalignment could unleash devastation. If Nibiru was such a world, tipping between extremes of heat and cold, stability and chaos, then its inhabitants would have internalized the dangers of overreach, and they may have carried that internalized warning into the foundations of human civilization. Yet even with this caution, there remains a curious contradiction. The Anunnaki did not merely warn, they built. They helped construct cities, temples, irrigation systems, calendars. Why create so much if they feared the consequences of uncontrolled advancement? Perhaps the answer lies in another pattern. The Anunnaki often acted not to elevate humanity, but to stabilize humanity. The difference is subtle, but profound. They did not seek to make humans powerful, they sought to make humans steady. Perhaps they saw in Earth a fragile world with the potential to flourish, if guided gently, if taught balance, if spared the reckless acceleration that once doomed their own home. This interpretation reshapes the myths of divine conflict. The disputes between Enlil and Enki, between the Anunnaki and the Igigi, between the gods and humanity. These conflicts may reflect deeper philosophical divides rooted in Nibiru's downfall. Some saw caution as the only path, others saw intervention as hope, and humanity found itself caught in the middle, inheriting pieces of both perspectives. But perhaps the most unsettling implication is that the Anunnaki's teachings were not simply cultural or technological, they were emotional. Humanity inherited not just knowledge, but fear. Not just stories, but longing. Not just warnings, but the lingering memory of a world that died slowly, painfully, under forces its people could not control. This finally leads to the question that forms like a soft shiver beneath all the myths. If the Anunnaki shaped early civilization with such caution, with such grief, with such deliberate restraint, then what exactly happened on Nibiru that made them fear humanity might one day repeat the same fate? By the time one reaches this point in the long trail of myths, laments, symbols and silences left behind by the Anunnaki, a picture begins to form, not of gods ruling from above, but of survivors carrying a wound so old it reshaped everything they taught. And in part 15, that wound becomes the central thread, for the emotional residue surrounding Nibiru's disappearance begins to clarify into something close to recognition. The Anunnaki did not leave their world simply because it was dying. They left because they had participated in its death. This possibility does not appear in any tablet openly, yet it lingers like a shadow behind countless narratives, small contradictions, abrupt silences, warnings that feel too heavy to be myth, hints that point toward a catastrophe not wholly natural. If Nibiru had merely succumbed to orbital decay, atmospheric collapse, or cosmic instability, the Anunnaki's sorrow would be immense but not conflicted. But their myths carry a tone deeper than grief, something closer to guilt. That guilt appears most clearly in the enigmatic myth known as the Error Epic. The text describes Error, a once benevolent god, unleashing destruction through negligence and pride. Scholars typically interpret this as an allegory for warfare or plague. But another layer surfaces when one examines the emotional cadence of the story. Error's regret is not rage dampened by reason. It is horror at having unleashed forces he cannot control. My radiance dimmed the sky, he laments. The foundations trembled beneath my steps. These lines sound eerily like memories of technological miscalculation, of energy unleashed that destabilized a world already fragile. The idea becomes even more chilling when placed alongside myths describing the weapons of heaven, tools that could scorch mountains, dry rivers, or darken skies. In the Enuma Elish, Marduk wields 4 winds capable of tearing apart cosmic bodies. In the Atrahasis, Enlil unleashes storms whose effects surpass natural boundaries. Even in later Hebrew texts, echoes of these events appear as divine fire, chariots of lightning, or the sky split open. While symbolic in religious context, many of these descriptions contain details too specific to be purely metaphorical, details evocative of technologies capable of catastrophic impact. If the Anunnaki once developed such technologies on Nibiru, perhaps to stabilize their failing world, perhaps to compensate for gravitational strain, perhaps to restore a collapsing atmosphere, then an error or disagreement in their use could have accelerated the planet's decline. Such a mistake might explain why their myths show divine conflict over power and restraint, why half their stories involve debates about order, balance, and hubris. A civilization that contributed to its own downfall would carry not only grief, but deep internal fracture. This fracture surfaces in the myth of the Igigi Revolt. Traditionally read as a tale of labourers rebelling against their elite overseers, the story holds another plausible meaning. Those closest to the machinery of survival, the ones tasked with maintaining whatever fragile technologies sustained Nibiru, may have been the first to recognise danger. The rebellion may reflect dissent over decisions that endangered the planet further. The myth's description of noise disturbing the heavens may conceal a reference to environmental strain, energy emissions, or atmospheric destabilization. And then there is the motif of the sealed gate, a symbol repeated across Mesopotamian myth. The gate that cannot be reopened, the path that cannot be retraced, the realm that cannot be returned to. Scholars treat this as a metaphor for the underworld, but earlier versions associate the sealed gate with the heavens, not the earth. The place behind the gate, an older tablet says, is where no breath remains. Another laments, we turned our backs when the great gate closed and the wind of our world grew thin. These fragments, once dismissed as cosmic poetry, now carry the unmistakable rhythm of eyewitness sorrow. If the Anunnaki were partly responsible for Nibiru's collapse, whether through ecological imbalance, misuse of planetary technologies, or internal conflict, then the sealed gate symbolizes exile not just from home, but from responsibility. They could not reverse the damage, they could not repair what they had broken, and so they sealed the truth behind mythic language, passing only the warnings forward, never the full story. This sensitivity to self-inflicted catastrophe may explain the profound caution with which the Anunnaki shaped early human development. Civilizations influenced by them, Sumer, Akkad, Babylonia, were taught strict systems of order, balance, humility, and restraint. The Mi were as much ethical frameworks as societal ones. The earliest laws punished waste, overuse, or imbalance harshly. Agriculture was designed to prevent soil depletion. Cities were structured around sustainable water cycles. Astronomical observation was treated not as curiosity, but as vigilance. These choices feel like the directives of a people terrified of watching another world collapse for preventable reasons. The emotional core of this fear becomes clearest in the Sumerian laments, where destruction is often portrayed not as divine will, but as consequence. Consequence of forgetting boundaries, consequence of imbalance, consequence of disturbing forces better left untouched. What has been done cannot be undone, one lament reads. The order we broke cannot be restored. Such lines carry an uncanny tension. Ancient authors treating cosmic disaster as the natural endpoint of human or divine error. Perhaps the Anunnaki insisted that humans embrace restraint because they themselves had not. In this light, their eventual withdrawal from Earth begins to make sense. A civilization racked by guilt and internal division might choose to step back, fearing that too much influence, too much power, could repeat the pattern that once doomed their own world. Their disappearance may not have been abandonment, but self-limitation, protection, not desertion. And yet, the stories insist they will return at the end of the age. Some see this as a promise of guidance, others as a threat. But perhaps it is neither. Perhaps the return simply marks the next cycle, the cycle that shaped their worldview and may still shape ours. A cycle of evaluation, not judgment, of reflection, not intervention, of bearing witness as they once bore witness to their own collapse. Which brings forward the quiet question that presses gently at the edges of every myth, every lament, every symbol left behind. If the Anunnaki fled a world they may have helped destroy, what do they see now when they look at Earth? Potential refuge, or a mirror beginning to reflect the same fragile cracks they once tried so desperately to escape? There is a certain heaviness that settles into the narrative now, a sense that the Anunnaki, once framed as distant cosmic figures, have become hauntingly human in their fears, their failures, and the choices they made after leaving Nibiru. And in part 16, this heaviness deepens into something quieter but more profound. An unspoken recognition that the Anunnaki did not simply flee destruction. They carried the memory of it into every corner of early human civilization, embedding fragments of their past into our own beginnings. These fragments appear first in subtle ways, especially in myths that describe the transmission of forbidden or dangerous knowledge. In the Sumerian legend of the Mi of the Deep, Enki hides certain principles, those deemed too volatile for humanity, within the waters of the Abzu. Scholars traditionally interpret this as symbolic concealment of mystical forces, but if read through the lens of a civilization traumatized by self-inflicted catastrophe, the symbolism changes entirely. Perhaps the dangerous knowledge Enki buries is not mystical at all, but technological. Perhaps these are memories of tools or methods that, in the final era of Nibiru, contributed to ecological collapse or planetary imbalance. Why preserve such knowledge in symbolic form rather than destroy it? A traumatized civilization often oscillates between regret and nostalgia. They cannot fully erase their past because it defines who they are, but they also cannot risk its repetition. This ambivalence surfaces vividly in the texts describing the Apkallu, the 7 sages who brought civilization to humanity. Their stories end abruptly with the Great Flood, after which only one sage, half human, half divine, remains. The others return to the deep. Scholars read this as mythic allegory, but its emotional context feels like something else. The Apkallu were withdrawn, not destroyed. Their presence became dangerous. Their knowledge had reached a threshold where passing more to humans risked repeating the catastrophe of their homeworld. Another striking trace of inherited trauma appears in the paradoxical language of the earliest Mesopotamian rituals. Priests invoke the gods not with confidence, but with an almost trembling deference. Rituals urge balance, humility, moderation, values unusual for cultures that viewed their deities as omnipotent. Why would divine beings demand restraint? Why insist upon boundaries in agriculture, water use, city planning? The tone resembles instructions given by those who have seen imbalance destroy a world and refuse to let it happen again. This theme becomes almost painfully clear in the myth of Enlil and the cities of Sumer. Enlil is portrayed not as a creative god, but as a guardian, a stern enforcer of balance who punishes excess. Modern readers often view him as severe, but his severity may mask something more nuanced: anxiety. A people who watched their own world teeter into ruin would emphasize caution to the point of rigidity. They would fear growth too rapid, ambition too bold, innovation too unchecked. In Enlil's cold vigilance, one hears the distant echo of a civilization terrified of its own potential. But the clearest evidence of inherited trauma lies not in their laws or their myths, but in their silences. The Anunnaki never speak plainly about Nibiru's fate, but they speak endlessly about maintaining harmony. They do not describe the catastrophe that ended their world, but they illustrate its shape through parable after parable. They offer no blueprint for technological advancement, only warnings about its consequences. It is telling that the oldest Sumerian term for wisdom, Niam, does not mean intelligence. It means to remember. Wisdom in their worldview was not cleverness, it was recollection. Recollection of patterns, recollection of cycles, recollection of mistakes. The Anunnaki did not ask humans to innovate, they asked humans to remember. Perhaps they hoped memory would succeed where knowledge alone had failed. This emphasis on memory appears globally wherever echoes of the Anunnaki seem to have brushed human imagination. In Egypt, wisdom is personified by Thoth, a figure associated with cosmic balance and the recording of all things. In the Vedic tradition, memory, SMRTE, is considered more sacred than revelation. Among the Dogon, ancestral teachers warned of the dangers of forgetting the sky. Even in early Greece, Mnemosyne, the goddess of memory, births the Muses, suggesting that all knowledge originates from remembering what once was. If these patterns stem from a single emotional origin, an inheritance from the Anunnaki, then humanity's deepest drive may not be curiosity at all, but the internal echo of someone else's fear of forgetting. This possibility casts an even stranger light on the mythic motif found across cultures, the idea that human beings were created incomplete, not merely physically, but spiritually, missing something, searching for something. This sense of incompleteness has puzzled anthropologists for decades, but if humanity was shaped, guided, or accelerated by a people defined by loss, then this feeling becomes understandable. It might be the residue of their longing bleeding into our own consciousness, an ancient hunger to recover something lost long before Earth ever existed. But what was lost? Stability? A home? A sense of cosmic belonging? The answer may lie in one of the oldest Sumerian epithets for the Anunnaki, those who walk between places, not between realms of the afterlife. Between places, between homes, between worlds. This identity is not triumphant, it is mournful. It describes a people who never truly belonged anywhere after leaving their own world behind. Exile became their nature, migration became their history, and Earth became only another waypoint in a long journey shaped by sorrow rather than choice. This wandering too appears encoded in humanity's earliest architectural instincts. Stone circles, pyramids, and ziggurats all share a common purpose: to anchor, to align, to stabilize. These structures suggest not a celebration of the sky, but an attempt to create order in a world that feels impermanent, a world that must constantly be fixed to something stable. Such an impulse may reflect a subconscious inheritance from beings who once lived under a sky that was anything but stable. But perhaps the deepest emotional imprint lies in humanity's fear of decline. Nearly every civilization preserves myths of a lost golden age, a time when the world was whole and harmony reigned. Whether it is Eden, Dilmun, Hyperborea, or Zep Tepi, the message is always the same: something precious was lost. The fall was inevitable, the decline irreversible. This is not a psychological pattern humans develop naturally, it is learned, it is inherited. It is the shadow of a memory older than human history. Which leads to a quiet, unnerving question, one the tablets never address directly, but one that hovers beneath every story of balance, warning, and cosmic sorrow. If the Anunnaki shaped early civilization because they feared humanity might repeat the catastrophe that destroyed Nibiru, Then what signs would they have watched for? What thresholds would they have warned against? And are those thresholds closer than we dare imagine? There is a point in this unfolding tapestry where the Anunnaki's presence ceases to feel like distant legend and becomes something more intimate, an emotional inheritance lingering inside humanity's oldest fears and deepest questions. By part 17, the narrative no longer revolves around what happened to Nibiru, but why the Anunnaki were so determined that Earth should not suffer the same fate. Their myths become less like stories told to impress humans, and more like confessions whispered in metaphor, encoding lessons born from a catastrophe no one wished to speak of directly. One of the clearest examples of this concealed confession lies in the Sumerian myth of the 7 judges of the underworld. These figures are described as those who decide when the foundations tremble. Their judgments determine whether the world remains stable or tips into chaos. Scholars tend to interpret the judges as personifications of natural forces, but their role, deciding when foundations tremble, echoes something else entirely, a memory of forces that once destabilized Nibiru itself, forces perhaps triggered by technological overreach, political conflict, or environmental collapse. The language describing these judges is strikingly similar to the phrasing used in laments about destroyed cities. The foundations trembled, the walls bowed, the breath was thin. These phrases are metaphors for disaster on Earth, but they may also mirror literal phenomena from Nibiru's collapse. A planet undergoing tectonic or atmospheric failure would have produced tremors, structural collapse, and a thinning atmosphere. The judges may therefore represent not mythic arbiters, but symbolic stand-ins for the forces that destroyed their home, preserved in poetic form because the raw truth was too painful to express. This sense of encoded memory also surfaces in the Sumerian fascination with measurement, not of size or quantity, but of thresholds. The earliest tablets describe precise limits for irrigation, boundaries for city expansion, quotas for livestock, even maximum lengths for ceremonial processions. The Anunnaki's teachings were defined by lines that must not be crossed. These boundaries are so unusually rigid in early Mesopotamian society that they feel inherited rather than invented, as though born from a trauma where exceeding limits once spelled catastrophe. If on Nibiru a fragile environment had collapsed due to overuse, imbalance, or mismanagement, then the Anunnaki's obsession with limits becomes not cultural quirk, but survival instinct transposed onto a new world. The fear of imbalance becomes even more visible when analysing the earliest temples. Ziggurats were not simply religious structures, they were cosmic stabilizers, aligned to correct for seasonal drift, stellar variation, and earthly perturbation. These buildings suggest a worldview in which the cosmos itself needed constant monitoring, where small deviations could herald disaster. This vigilance makes sense for a people shaped by a world with an unstable orbit. But for Earth, a comparatively stable planet, such vigilance seems excessive, unless the teachers who introduced it were trying to instill a caution that had once arrived too late. Another clue lies in the curious way Mesopotamian myths describe covenant breaking. When humans cross certain boundaries, moral, ecological, or cosmic, the gods respond with disproportionate severity. Floods, droughts, famine. Scholars usually read these as moral allegories, but the emotional charge within these stories feels like something else. Fear. A fear that once stemmed from experience, not theology. A fear that, on another world, imbalance escalated rapidly and irreversibly until the planet itself could no longer sustain life. What the myths present as divine punishment may therefore be the Anunnaki's coded warnings. Do not repeat what we once did. Do not allow imbalance to grow. Do not push a stable world toward instability. This code of caution appears globally across cultures influenced, directly or indirectly, by ancient Mesopotamia. In Egypt, Ma'at represents balance so delicate that the slightest deviation threatens cosmic collapse. In India, RTA embodies a cosmic order that must be preserved at all costs. In Greece, hubris brings nemesis. These universal warnings against overreach may not be universal at all. They may be cultural echoes of a specific trauma carried by a displaced people. The possibility becomes sharper when examining Sumer's obsession with cyclical catastrophes. They believed history did not advance linearly but moved in cycles punctuated by collapse and renewal. This worldview makes sense only for a people whose ancestors had lived through multiple cycles of environmental or cosmic danger. If Nibiru's orbit brought it repeatedly near destructive regions, radiation belts, gravitational extremes, meteor swarms, its inhabitants would have developed a cultural expectation of periodic catastrophe. They would have taught their descendants to anticipate collapse, not as punishment, but as cosmic inevitability. Humanity, inheriting this worldview without the original context, interpreted cycles as divine fate, prophecies, or moral consequence. But beneath these interpretations may lie a very old, very real memory of a world governed by unstable cycles, carried into Earth's earliest civilizations like a faint, trembling echo. This echo also emerges in humanity's persistent fear of the sky turning against us. Ancient cultures feared eclipses, cometary returns, sudden darkness, unexpected light. They performed rituals not just to appease gods, but to steady themselves, because somewhere in the collective memory, the sky truly had become dangerous. Not Earth's sky, but the sky of the people who taught us our first cosmologies. The same fear surfaces strangely in myths that describe forbidden realms. The Mountain of the Lands in Sumer, the Isle of Fire in Egyptian lore, the burning land of the Vedas, all places where the air is wrong, where the world is unstable, where a step too far brings doom. These realms may echo memories of regions on Nibiru deemed unsafe after collapse, zones of radiation, seismic instability, or atmospheric failure. What humans later mythologized as supernatural danger may originally have been descriptions of literal uninhabitable regions. Yet amid these warnings, something else appears: longing. This longing permeates their hymns, their rituals, even their architectural choices. Temples point upward not as monuments to gods, but as memorials to something vanished. The Sumerian word for heaven and also means the high place that cannot be reached. Not the home of gods, but a home lost, a home remembered, a home mourned. In this light, the Anunnaki's departure from Earth appears not as finality but as continuation. They were never truly here to stay. Their identities were shaped by wandering, by loss, by moving on from a world that could not sustain them. Earth may have offered refuge, but not permanence. Which leaves one final question, a quiet, trembling question that seems to rise naturally at this point in the journey. If the Anunnaki carried into humanity the memory of a world undone by imbalance, then what part of that memory still whispers to us whenever we look at our own world and feel a shiver we cannot quite explain? A sense that something familiar, something ancient, might be beginning again. As the story deepens, the Anunnaki no longer appear as distant cosmic visitors, but as bearers of a sorrow so old it shaped the way early humans understood the world. By part 18, their legacy feels less like mythology and more like a quiet inheritance, one that touches the deepest corners of human imagination. If they truly carried the memory of Nibiru's decline into Earth's earliest civilizations, then it is in this part of the journey that those memories begin to surface most clearly, woven into myths that speak of renewal, destruction, and the fragile threads that hold worlds together. One of the most revealing myths comes from an unexpected place, the Sumerian tale of the measuring line of heaven. In this obscure fragment, the gods stretch a cosmic thread across the sky to ensure the foundations of the earth remain stable. Scholars view it as poetic imagery describing divine order. Yet the emotional tone of the text suggests something deeper. The gods are anxious. They measure not to rule, but to confirm that nothing has shifted. It reads like the behavior of a people who once watched their world slip out of alignment, literally. A culture shaped by orbital instability would develop rituals centered around checking, measuring, recalibrating. What we interpret as mythic symbolism may be an echo of scientific vigilance turned into spiritual practice. Another clue appears in the puzzling way Sumerian texts describe celestial anomalies. Tablets from the library of Ashurbanipal warn of stars that wander wrongly, winds that blow when they should not, and the darkening of the seven. These warnings are deeply emotional, often framed with panic. On Earth, such events are rare and usually harmless. But on a world like Nibiru, whose orbit may have carried it through regions of cosmic turbulence, such anomalies could have been signs of impending catastrophe. When a civilization lives through eras where the sky itself becomes unpredictable, vigilance becomes theology. This psychological imprint becomes even more evident when examining the Sumerian flood narrative. Unlike later reinterpretations that frame the flood as punishment, the original story of Atrahasis is steeped in regret. The gods mourn the destruction, not because humans suffered, but because they fear what the destruction represents. Imbalance, loss, a world tipping too far. When the waters recede, the gods do not rejoice, they grieve. Their lament includes an unsettling line. We watched our world drown once, we cannot watch it again. Scholars have puzzled over this phrase for decades, assuming it metaphorical. But if the Anunnaki carried memories of Nibiru's decline, of seas rising, winds shifting, climates collapsing, then the flood was more than a catastrophic event on Earth. It was a reawakening of a wound they had tried desperately to bury. This wound also appears in the myth of Utnapishtim's exile. After surviving the flood, he is taken to a distant realm where time does not touch. Many interpret this as paradise, others see it as punishment, but the emotional undertone suggests something else. Utnapishtim is removed from humanity because he carries knowledge humans should not bear. A survivor of destruction may inadvertently pass on trauma, or worse, teach others how to replicate the mistakes that caused it. Perhaps Utnapishtim's exile mirrors the Anunnaki's own retreat from Earth, driven by fear that their presence could lead humans toward paths once taken on Nibiru. This fear becomes clearer when examining the stories of forbidden crafts. In one myth, Enki forbids the use of a device that can raise the great storm. Another text warns of the metal that bites the breath of the earth. These phrases are usually interpreted as metaphorical, but their emotional charge suggests first-hand experience with tools that once destabilized their world. Tools powerful enough to alter climate, landscape, or atmosphere. If the Anunnaki possessed advanced technologies on Nibiru that contributed to environmental imbalance, they may have intentionally withheld them from humanity. The theme repeats globally. The ancient Greeks describe Prometheus as punished for giving humanity fire, symbolically interpreted as knowledge. But the punishment feels excessive, as if fire represented more than warmth or innovation. In some versions, Prometheus gives humans the tools of the sky, a phrase obscure enough to raise questions. Could this myth too be a distorted memory of forbidden knowledge? Technologies once misused, now considered too dangerous to pass on? This caution becomes even more poignant when you examine the oldest astronomical temples on Earth. Göbekli Tepe, predating agriculture, is aligned to celestial events with astonishing precision. The same alignment appears in Egypt, in Andean temples, in megaliths scattered across Europe. Such alignment is unnecessary for early human survival, unless it served a deeper purpose. A purpose inherited from memories of a world once thrown into chaos because its inhabitants failed to read the sky properly. Humanity may have been taught to track celestial cycles not because Earth required it, but because the Anunnaki did. Another vital thread lies in the global myth of the Great Return. Civilizations around the world speak of a time when the teachers from the sky will reappear, not to rule, not to save, but to observe the turning of another cycle. The Maya called this the return of the Q-Hula-Jau. The Egyptians awaited the Neteru. The Persians foresaw the Freshokharati. Even the Norse imagined the gods returning after Ragnarok to rebuild. These myths do not predict apocalypse, they predict evaluation. They suggest a cycle in which those who once taught humanity will check whether their lessons have been heeded, or whether the shadows of Nibiru's downfall have crept silently into Earth's future. Which leads to the unsettling question scholars rarely ask. What if these myths do not describe divine beings returning to Earth, but are people who once fled a dying world, returning to see whether the world they gave their warnings to stands on the edge of the same precipice? Because in the final analysis, everything the Anunnaki emphasized, balance, memory, restraint, vigilance, reflects not universal cosmic truths, but the lived experience of a civilization that nearly destroyed itself. And this brings us to the most fragile, most human question hidden beneath every myth, every lament, every cycle preserved by ancient scribes. If the Anunnaki embedded their warnings into the foundations of early civilization to prevent Earth from repeating Nibiru's fate, then what happens when they return and see how closely our world now mirrors the one they once tried desperately to escape? There is a moment, late in this long unravelling of myth and memory, when the shape of the Anunnaki's story begins to turn back toward us, not as ancient tales fading into distant time, but as a mirror held uncomfortably close. By part 19, it becomes clear that the true mystery is no longer what happened to Nibiru, nor even why the Anunnaki fled, but what they feared we would one day become. Everything they left behind, every warning disguised as myth, every ritual teaching disguised as religion, every architectural alignment disguised as devotion, points to a single, haunting preoccupation. Cycles repeat. Worlds fall the same way they rise. And the Anunnaki, more than any ancient people, understood the cost of ignoring the signs. One of the clearest reflections of this fear lies in a Sumerian poem rarely mentioned outside scholarly circles, The Lament of the Silent Ones. The text, fragmented and fragile, describes those who watch from afar as they observe humanity thriving after the flood. But instead of rejoicing, they speak with something closer to dread. They build as we once built. They hunger as we once hungered. Their fires glow like ours did when the last dawn broke upon our home. The poignancy of these lines is often dismissed as poetic metaphor. But read through the lens of everything uncovered so far, the lament feels like a quiet recognition. Humanity was beginning to follow the same trajectory Nibiru once walked. Innovation without restraint, expansion without balance, desire without memory. This fear underpins the strange and often contradictory behavior of the gods in later Mesopotamian stories. They bestow knowledge, then warn against its use. They teach humans governance, then threaten catastrophe if rulers become too ambitious. They encourage agriculture, then send drought when the land is overworked. These are not inconsistent deities. They are traumatized survivors attempting desperately to redirect a pattern they recognize too well. The clearest example is found in the Epic of Gilgamesh. Gilgamesh's quest is not simply for immortality. It is for exemption, from decay, from loss, from limits. He seeks what the Anunnaki themselves could not escape. And when Utnapishtim denies him the secret of eternal life, he does so with words that feel borrowed from another world entirely. Immortality is the burden of those who watch their home fall. Boundlessness is not a gift, it is the beginning of ruin. This line is often overlooked, yet it reveals something profound. For the Anunnaki, immortality was not a privilege but a curse, because it forced them to endure the slow unravelling of their world. To them, the human desire to escape mortality felt like a dangerous echo of the hubris that once accelerated Nibiru's collapse. Another layer of this fear emerges when examining the myth of the seven evil winds, described as forces unleashed when cosmic boundaries are broken. Scholars interpret these winds as metaphors for disaster, but their descriptions, scorching heat, suffocating cold, poisonous air, trembling earth, parallel conditions consistent with rapid environmental collapse. Perhaps these winds are symbolic memories of what Nibiru endured in its final centuries: atmospheric destabilization, climate extremes, tectonic upheaval. If so, the myth does more than warn, it remembers. This memory appears to have shaped not only ancient Mesopotamia, but the psychological architecture of civilizations across the world. Cultures separated by oceans and thousands of years share eerily similar anxieties: fear of a sky that dims, fear of waters rising, fear of fire falling from the heavens. These are primal fears, but they are also oddly detailed, as though inherited, not imagined. If early humans learned from the Anunnaki, then these fears may represent the emotional residue of a catastrophe our ancestors never experienced directly, but were taught to fear instinctively. This possibility becomes sharper when examining the ancient obsession with environmental balance. Every early civilization left warnings etched into stone. Do not overuse the land, do not exhaust the waters, do not defy the cycles. In Egypt, the sin against Ma'at, cosmic balance, was the gravest offense. In China, emperors were judged by the health of the natural world. In the Andes, offerings were made to mountains not out of superstition, but out of fear that imbalance would awaken devastation. These cultural instincts do not arise spontaneously. They spread because someone taught them, someone who had lived through the consequences of imbalance. This brings us back to the most unsettling implication of the Anunnaki narrative, the belief that cycles return, Not merely philosophical cycles, but cosmic ones, cycles in which civilizations reach thresholds so dangerous that only collapse can restore balance. The Maya spoke of these thresholds, so did the Vedic seers, so did the Greek Stoics, and the Sumerians were perhaps the most explicit, recording predictions of the days when the foundations crack and the times when the breath of the world thins. Modern scholars argue these are metaphors for political instability, but the emotional texture of these predictions feels older, heavier, like memories of planetary crisis wrapped in prophecy. If the Anunnaki feared Earth might one day mirror Nibiru's fall, their withdrawal takes on new meaning. They did not leave because humans displeased them. They left because too much influence risked accelerating the cycle. Teaching too much too quickly could lead to the same technological hubris that once doomed their home. Perhaps they withdrew, hoping that, in their absence, humanity would grow slower, more gently, more sustainably. But humanity did not grow slowly. In only a fraction of the time it took Nibiru's civilization to rise, humans achieved similar heights of innovation and similar patterns of overreach. This brings us to the most delicate thread of all, the global myth of the returning ones. Whether called the Watchers, the Shining Ones, the Elder Brothers, or the Sky People, nearly every culture anticipates a time when the beings who once instructed humanity will come again. This expectation is often framed as judgment or salvation. But read through the lens of the Anunnaki story, it feels more like concern, a return not to rule, but to witness, to see whether their warnings were heard, to see whether humanity is approaching the same threshold their own world once crossed. And this leads to the question rising like a quiet tremor through the heart of this journey. Not apocalyptic, not prophetic, but profoundly human. If the Anunnaki once watched their world fall because its people ignored the limits meant to protect it, then when they look upon Earth and see how closely our patterns resemble their own, what do they feel? Recognition? Fear? Grief? Or the quiet sorrow of those who know that cycles once set in motion rarely stop? There is a kind of stillness that settles over the final stretch of this long journey, an almost fragile quiet, as though the story itself understands that we have reached the edge of something vast and difficult to articulate. By part 20, the Anunnaki no longer feel like distant mythic figures or cosmic travellers, but something far more haunting, a memory carried forward through human history, scattered in rituals, symbols, fragments of ancient languages, and the unspoken fears that lie beneath our fascination with the sky. And now, after tracing these threads through floods, laments, warnings, and half-buried truths, one realization becomes almost impossible to ignore. The Anunnaki story was never really separate from ours. It was an inheritance, quiet, sorrowful, and unresolved. But perhaps the most astonishing revelation is that the question we began with, why the Anunnaki abandoned Nibiru, has transformed. It is no longer simply a question about the past. It has become a question about the present, and perhaps the future. One of the final clues emerges from a curious text found among the so-called exorcistic tablets of the first millennium BCE. Hidden within rituals meant to pacify restless spirits, there is a phrase that seems oddly out of place. Beware the age when the breath of the world grows thin, for the ones who fled that silence know its sound. Scholars treat it as metaphorical language meant to evoke fear, but the phrase resonates too precisely with what a world like Nibiru might have endured. Atmospheric depletion, environmental collapse, air growing unbreathable. The warning is phrased not as speculation, but as memory. Across the ancient Near East, similar fragments appear, scattered like pieces of a story that no one was meant to speak plainly. In the Ugaritic texts, the sky that once betrayed them. In the Hittite ritual of the diviner. Those who were driven from the high places by the thinning wind. In later Hermetic fragments, they lost the breath of their first world. Each phrase feels like a whisper of something older than the civilizations that wrote them, an inherited sorrow passed down so many generations that its original context dissolved, leaving only the emotional shape. This emotional shape appears again in the mythic obsession with the Watchers, beings who observe humanity but do not intervene. It is impossible to read these stories now without sensing the subtext. Perhaps the Watchers are not guardians in the traditional sense, but witnesses. Witnesses who once watched their own world unravel. witnesses who return not to judge or protect, but simply because they cannot help but look for the signs they once missed. And what exactly were those signs? In the tablets of omen literature, usually dismissed as superstition, the warnings repeat with the unnerving consistency. Unexplained warming, irregular winds, darkened skies, the shifting of seasons, the loss of predictability in the heavens. To the ancient scribes, these were divine messages, but to the Anunnaki, if these texts preserve their memories, these may have been the very patterns that preceded Nibiru's decline. If so, then the most unsettling truth of all may be this. The Anunnaki did not leave Nibiru because they were destined to. They left because they recognized, perhaps too late, that their world was already beyond saving, and they feared that one day another civilization might reach the same precipice. This fear can be felt in the way they taught. They offered knowledge, but wrapped it in warnings. They gifted writing, but framed it as responsibility. They introduced agriculture, but demanded cycles of rest to protect the soil. They permitted kingship, but tied it to a moral code meant to prevent the abuses that once fractured their own world. Everything they taught had an echo of restraint, an undercurrent of caution, a whisper that said, "Do not make the mistakes we made." But perhaps the most striking inheritance is not in texts or temples, but in the human psyche itself. Humanity carries an inexplicable sense of nostalgia for something undefined, a longing for a lost home we never lived in. Ancient peoples placed their golden ages not in their own past, but somewhere beyond reach. Dilmun, Eden, Zep-Tepi, the first time. These are not simply cultural projections. They feel like distant recollections of a world that once was, remembered not through direct experience, but through the emotional residue left by those who mourned their first home. The Anunnaki, in this reading, did not merely shape human civilization. They shaped the way humans dream. They seeded our collective imagination with a memory of loss, a fear of imbalance, a longing for stability. And they may have done so because they knew that memory, not technology, is the only force strong enough to prevent the repetition of catastrophe. Which brings us to the quietest, most difficult question at the heart of the narrative. If the Anunnaki embedded their fears, their hopes, and their warnings into the earliest layers of human civilization, then what do they see now as they look upon the world we have built? Do they see a species that learned their lessons, one that builds with consciousness, preserves with intention, measures its impact with humility? Or do they see, in us, the same accelerating patterns that once pushed Nibiru past its point of return, extraction without balance, growth without limit, ambition without caution? And perhaps the most haunting question of all, if the Anunnaki truly walk between worlds, returning only when cycles tighten and thresholds are approached, then what happens when they return and discover that humanity, despite all their warnings, may be standing on the very same ledge? Whether they return in silence or in presence, whether they judge or simply observe, the story remains open, drifting like a final breath from a world long vanished. And maybe that is how it was meant to be. Not a closed narrative, but an invitation. A quiet reminder that every civilization carries within it the memory of another, and every world reflects the fragility of the one before. And so the journey ends not with certainty, but with a question that lingers softly in the dark, waiting to be answered not by gods but by us. What do we choose to remember, and what future will that memory create?